He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the entire mercantile to hear. Nobody wants damaged goods. Harlan Greed stood in the center of Mercer's Dry Goods, the store that carried Eliza's own family name on its sign. And he laughed while he said it. Laughed the way men laugh when they know no one will stop them. The women near the fabric bolts went quiet. The clerk behind the counter found something urgent to study on the floor. And Eliza Mercer, 26 years old, stood holding a spool of brown thread she would never pay for, feeling every eye in that room decide in real time that Harlan was probably right. That was 3 months ago. Tonight she was finally doing what she should have done the morning after. She was leaving. If you have ever stood at a door with everything you own packed into one bag, knowing the town behind you had already written your ending, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. And if this is your first time here, I want to ask you something before we begin. What would you have done if the whole world had already decided who you were? Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1884, and a door that was about to open from the wrong side. The suitcase wasn't large. That was the most honest thing about that night, the smallness of it. Everything Eliza Mercer owned in the world fit inside a brown leather bag that had belonged to her mother, with a broken latch she'd fixed 3 times using the same piece of wire. She'd packed it in the dark, working by feel more than by sight, because lighting the lamp would have made it real. As long as she moved in the dark, she could pretend she was only dreaming. She could pretend she was someone else entirely. She wasn't. The room around her was the back room of her cousin Adele's house, which was generous of Adele and humiliating for Eliza in equal measure. A cot pressed against the wall. A single nail where her coat hung. A window that faced the alley behind the feed store, so what she saw every morning wasn't sky. It was a wall. She had been sleeping in this room for 11 weeks, ever since Harlan Greed's story spread through Red Creek. The way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, total, and indifferent to the truth. She set the suitcase near the door and stood in the silence for a moment. She had been a seamstress, a good one, not the kind who embroidered flowers on pillowcases for ladies who had nothing better to want. She had been genuinely skilled, the kind of woman who could take a bolt of terrible fabric and cut it into something that made a person stand taller. She'd built a small business, thread by thread. She'd had regular customers. She'd had a name people said without lowering their voices. Then Harlan Greed decided he wanted something from her that she wouldn't give him. And when she said no, he made certain she had nothing left. He told the Reverend's wife she'd propositioned him. He told the banker she'd stolen yardage from 2 separate orders. He told anyone who asked, and plenty who didn't, that Eliza Mercer was the kind of woman a decent town was better off without. The lies weren't even particularly creative. That was the part that kept her awake at night. They weren't elaborate or clever. They were simple and ugly, and people believed them anyway, because Harlan Greed had money and Eliza Mercer had a backroom cot. She lost her customers in the first week, lost her rented workspace in the second. By the 3rd week, she stopped walking down Main Street because the particular silence that fell when people saw her coming had started to feel like something physical, like walking through cold water, that kind of resistance, that kind of chill. Adele had been kind. Adele had given her the room and said, "You can stay as long as you need." But Adele also had a husband who was uncomfortable, and 2 daughters who were starting to ask questions, and a reputation she needed to protect in a town that had just finished destroying Eliza's. The kindness was real, but it had edges. Everything had edges now. So Eliza packed her bag in the dark, before sunrise, on a Tuesday morning in early November when the Wyoming cold had gotten serious, and the sky outside that alley window was still completely black. She had $43 and some coins. She had a plan to take the stage east to Laramie, and from there she didn't know. And she'd stopped letting herself think about it because every time she did, the not knowing opened into something that felt bottomless, and she needed to stay functional until she got through the door. After the door, she could fall apart. After the door. Her hand closed around the doorknob. 3 knocks. Not loud. Not frantic. 3 calm, deliberate knocks. Like someone who had thought about knocking before doing it and decided, yes, this is the right thing. She stood absolutely still. Outside, the wind was coming off the plains the way it always did. that low, constant pressure that made Red Creek feel like a town the world was slowly trying to push over. Nobody knocked on back doors before sunrise. Nobody who knew her knocked on doors at all anymore, at least not to visit. The people who'd knocked in recent weeks had been delivering messages from the sort of men who thought a woman in a difficult situation was an opportunity. She almost didn't open it, but the knocks had been calm. And she was tired, bone-tired in a way that went past sleep. And some part of her was curious in the way a person gets curious when they've already decided they have nothing left to lose. She opened the door. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, in the way ranchers get from actual work rather than intention, wearing a coat that had seen better years and a hat he'd taken off and was holding in both hands in front of him. He had dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, a jaw that needed a shave by about 2 days, and eyes the color of old fence posts, a kind of weathered gray-brown that had seen too much sun. He looked at her suitcase first, then at her face, and something crossed his expression that wasn't pity. She couldn't entirely name what it was. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who had packed their own bags in the dark and knew what that particular posture meant. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was low, not whispered, but considered. "My name is Silas Boone. I have a cattle ranch about 14 miles north. I've got 2 kids, no help, and a winter coming that's going to be worse than last year." She stared at him. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what people say about you," he continued, and there was something almost painful about how direct he was. No softening, no easing in. "I'm also not going to pretend I believe it. I've been watching this town for 3 months, and what I've seen is a woman who kept her head up while everyone around her was trying to make her look down." He paused. "I'm offering work. Real work. Cooking, mending, helping with the children. 2 weeks to start. I pay fair, I keep my word, and I don't talk." The wind moved between them. Somewhere down the alley, something metal knocked against something else. "You came here before sunrise," she said. "I figured if I waited until morning, you'd be gone." He glanced at the suitcase again. "Was I wrong?" She should have said yes. She should have said yes. "You were wrong. I'm not going anywhere. Close the door," and made that be true. The lie would have been cleaner. The lie would have kept her moving toward Laramie and the bottomless not knowing that waited there, which was at least a different kind of awful than this one. Instead, what came out of her was, "How do you know you can trust me?" He put his hat back on, adjusted the brim once, with 2 fingers, like a period at the end of a sentence. "How do you know you can trust me?" he said back, and there wasn't any challenge in it. It was a real question. He was asking her to think about it the same way he had. Eliza looked at this man she had never spoken to in her life. She looked at the dark, empty alley behind him, and the black sky above it, and the suitcase beside her that represented the total sum of her remaining options. 2 weeks, she said. She didn't know yet that she would never finish counting them. Whoa. The ride north took nearly 3 hours, and Silas Boone did not fill the silence with words the way nervous people do. He drove the wagon, she sat beside him, and what passed between them was mostly wind and the sound of hooves and the gradual, reluctant lightening of the sky. She appreciated it in a way she couldn't have explained. She had spent 3 months around people who either talked too much, usually to say things that hurt her, or went too quiet in the specific way that meant they were judging. This was different. This was someone who simply didn't feel the need. She used the time to watch the land change. Red Creek sat in a valley, and as you rode north, the valley opened and flattened, and the sky got larger in a way that felt either freeing or terrifying depending on the state of your heart. For Eliza that morning, it was somewhere between the two. The cold was serious, the kind that found its way through coat seams and settled into your shoulders. But the sky as the sun came up was doing something extravagant with pink and pale gold that she didn't feel entitled to enjoy but couldn't entirely ignore. "How old are your children?" she asked, not because she'd decided to care yet, but because she needed something concrete to think about. "Hazel's 9, Owen's 6. He kept his eyes on the horses. "Hazel's the one you need to be careful with." "Careful how?" "She doesn't trust easy." He was quiet a moment. She got lied to too many times after her mother died. People promising they'd come back, promising they'd help, promising things they had no intention of following through on. She keeps a count in her head. "I can't see it, but I know it's there." Eliza nodded. She understood the internal ledger. She had one herself. "And Owen?" Owen hasn't said more than 50 words since June, Silas said it plainly, not like he was asking for sympathy. He talks to the horses some. He talked to a stray cat for a while last summer. He's not... There's nothing wrong with him, the doctor said. He's just waiting for something. I don't know what. She thought about that for a while. A 6-year-old waiting for something and not finding words for what it was. And what's about you? She asked, and immediately felt she'd overstepped. He took so long to answer that she'd decided he wasn't going to. I'm surviving, he said finally. I'm looking for something a little better than that. When they arrived, the ranch declared itself through practicality rather than charm. The main house was 2 stories of solid, weathered timber. Nothing pretty about it, nothing meant to be. A barn that was actually in better shape than the house. Fencing that someone had maintained carefully because broken fencing on a cattle ranch was money lost, not just appearance. A yard with the specific disorder that comes from 2 children and a man who is too tired at night to be tidy and knows it. She got down from the wagon herself before he could offer assistance, and she saw him notice that and not comment on it. Small thing. It mattered. Hazel was standing on the porch, 9 years old, arms crossed over her chest, brown hair in a braid that had survived about 2 days past when it should have been redone, watching Eliza come up the path with the focused, unimpressed assessment of someone who had learned the hard way what optimism cost. Her eyes were her father's, that weathered gray-brown, but sharper, the way eyes get when they're working overtime because they've decided they can't trust anything else. You're from town, Hazel said. Not a greeting, a statement of the potentially damning fact. I was, Eliza said. People in town say things about you. People in town say a lot of things. Are they true? Eliza stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at this girl who was 9 years old and already carrying the weight of someone much older, and she made a choice, possibly the most important one she'd made since the doorknob, which was to not be gentle about it. No, she said. Most of them aren't, but I can't make you believe that. You're going to have to figure it out yourself. Hazel's arms stayed crossed, but something in her expression shifted, barely, by about a degree, the way a door shifts when someone puts their hand on the handle and hasn't turned it yet. Fine, she said, and went inside. Silas, standing behind Eliza, said quietly, That's the best reaction she's given anyone in 8 months. Owen appeared from around the side of the barn sometime later, materializing the way small children do, suddenly, silently, as though the air had simply arranged itself into a 6-year-old. He had his father's build in miniature, but his face was his mother's, Eliza would learn later. Something softer there, and more frightened. He looked at her the way he might look at weather, something you couldn't negotiate with, that was just going to be whatever it was going to be. He didn't speak. She didn't try to make him. Instead, she looked at the house and said, to no one in particular, Where do you keep your mending? Owen pointed at the door. Thank you, she said, and went in. That first morning, she found 3 months of unmended laundry piled in a basket in the kitchen corner. She found a meal situation that was functional in the way a person surviving alone is functional. Nobody was starving, but nobody was eating anything that required caring about. She found a window in the back bedroom with a crack in the lower pane that someone had stuffed with rags and forgotten, which was letting cold air pour in steadily. She found a cast iron stove that needed to be reintroduced to the concept of itself. She did not remake everything at once. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She fixed the window first because that was the thing that would make the most immediate difference to a 6-year-old sleeping in that room. Then she started the stove. Then she went through the mending pile with the methodical focus of someone who was very good at this particular thing and knew it. When Silas came in at midday, she had a pot of something on the stove that smelled like she'd found real ingredients in that kitchen after all, and the mending pile had been reduced by half. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. You didn't have to do all this, he said. You're paying me, she said, without turning around. This is what you're paying me for. He was quiet. Then, it smells different in here. Like food? Like a house, he said, and his voice did something on that last word that she decided not to examine. She turned around then, because she wanted to see his face when she said the next thing, and she needed to say it before it got buried under politeness and arrangement. Mr. Boone, I need to be honest with you about something. He waited. I don't know how to be around people who are decent to me anymore, she said. It's been long enough that I think I've forgotten the shape of it. So if I seem sharp or cold, or like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, that's why. It's not anything you've done." He considered that with the same deliberateness he seemed to bring to most things. "That's fair," he said. "I've got my own version of the same problem." "What do you mean?" He leaned against the doorframe, and she saw the exhaustion in him then. Not just the daily tiredness of a man who worked hard, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from running on something other than hope for so long that you can't remember what hope felt like when you had it. "I know what the town says about me too," he said, "that I never recovered, that I let the ranch go to ruin after Clara died, and I've been holding on by charity cases and stubbornness." He met her eyes. "I don't know what they'd say now about me bringing you here." "Nothing kind," she said. "No." He straightened up. "But I stopped making decisions based on what Harlan Greed and his friends think about them." He paused. "A while back." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "You know him," she said. "I know what he does to people," Silas said. "I watched him do it to the Halverson family 3 years ago. Run them out of the valley over a water rights dispute that was more about Harlan wanting their land than any legitimate claim. I didn't say anything then, because it wasn't my business, and I had enough of my own." Something in his jaw tightened. "I've been sorry about that ever since." She looked at him for a long moment. "This isn't your way of making up for that," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," he said. "This is my way of acknowledging that I need help, and you need work, and Harlan Greed doesn't get to decide who's allowed to provide it." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'm going back out to the east fence. It'll be dark by 5. He was halfway to the door when she said, "Mr. Boone." He turned. "The children's rooms need more heat. If you have extra woodcut, I can keep both stoves going." He looked at her for a second, and the thing that crossed his face was not pity and not gratitude exactly. It was closer to relief, the specific, fragile relief of a man who has been carrying everything alone for so long that someone simply offering to hold one corner of the weight becomes something he wasn't prepared to feel. "I'll bring it in tonight," he said. She turned back to her stove, and the house held around her. Not warmly, not yet, but differently than it had that morning. Like something that had been holding its breath had started, very slowly, to let it out. She told herself it was only 2 weeks, but standing there in that kitchen, with Owen's small footsteps moving somewhere above her head, and the smell of real food filling the rooms and the wind coming off the mountains instead of that alley wall, Eliza Mercer had the first thought she'd had in 3 months that wasn't about leaving. She thought, "These children are cold. This house is tired. And whoever lets Harlan Greed have the last word on this doesn't know what they're made of yet." She stirred the pot. She didn't know yet that she was already counting the wrong things, counting days instead of reasons, counting exits instead of the thing that was quietly, stubbornly beginning to take root right beneath her feet. The first week at the Boone Ranch did not go smoothly. Nobody had promised it would, and Eliza was grateful for that. She'd had enough of promises that dissolved on contact with reality. What she got instead was harder and more honest than smooth, and she found she could work with that. The mornings started before light, not because anyone asked her to. Silas was already out by the time she came downstairs, had been for an hour at least, and the ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse kept their own schedule. But because Eliza had spent 11 weeks in Adele's back room, lying awake listening to the town outside her window, and the habit of sleeplessness had become something close to permanent. She came down in the dark, and she started the stove, and she stood in the kitchen listening to the house breathe around her, and gradually, in increments too small to name, she stopped feeling like a trespasser in someone else's life. The mending she finished on the 3rd day. 3 months of it. Shirts with buttons missing or elbows through, 2 of Hazel's dresses that had been let down as far as they would go, and then split at the seam when she kept growing anyway, a coat of Owen's that had a lining hanging in strips, like something had gotten at it from the inside. She worked through the pile with the efficiency of someone who had once done this professionally and hadn't forgotten how, even if everything else about her former life had been stripped away. When she set the last folded item on the kitchen table and looked at the empty basket, something tightened briefly in her chest. Not grief exactly. More like the feeling of picking up an old tool you thought you'd lost and discovering your hand still knows exactly how to hold it. Hazel noticed. Of course Hazel noticed. The girl had the observational capacity of someone twice her age and the emotional caution to match. She came into the kitchen on the fourth morning, picked up her mended dress, held it up to look at the seam, and set it back down without saying anything. Then she sat at the table and watched Eliza make breakfast. "You sew better than Mrs. Clifton," Hazel said finally. Mrs. Clifton was, Eliza would learn, the woman who had come to help the previous spring and lasted 11 days before deciding the isolation was more than she'd contracted for. The name had come up once, from Silas, in a tone that held no bitterness but a great deal of tiredness. "I've been doing it a long time," Eliza said. "How long?" "Since I was about your age." Hazel processed this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "My mother sewed," she said. "She wasn't very good at it. She made me a doll once, and it looked like something that had been in an accident." The unexpected specificity of that caught Eliza off guard, and a sound came out of her that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that it surprised her. Hazel watched her recover. "She knew it was bad," the girl continued. "She laughed about it too. She kept it on the shelf anyway because she said the effort counted more than the outcome." "She sounds like she was smart," Eliza said carefully. "She was." Hazel looked at the table. "People say that to be nice, but she actually was." "I believe you." Hazel looked up sharply, assessing whether that was a performance. Whatever she found in Eliza's face must have been acceptable because she didn't argue the point. She picked up her fork when breakfast was ready and ate, and the silence between them had changed its texture again, the way it did every day by some degree that was almost imperceptible and entirely real. Owen remained his own particular mystery. He appeared and disappeared around the edges of the day with a quality that Eliza could only describe as spectral, not in any alarming way, but in the way of a creature that has learned to live in the margins. He ate his meals. He followed his father to the barn in the morning and came back when Silas came back. He slept. But he did not speak to Eliza, and she did not push, because she had made a decision early on that earning Owen's trust was not something she could accomplish through effort or charm. It would happen, or it wouldn't. The most she could do was be consistent enough that he stopped bracing every time she moved through the room. On the fifth day, she found him standing outside the chicken coop, staring at something on the ground. She almost walked past. Then she stopped, because what he was looking at was a hen that was clearly not well, sitting low, feathers wrong, the stillness of something that had stopped fighting. She stood beside him for a moment, not speaking. "She stopped eating 2 days ago," Owen said. His voice was scratchy from disuse, like a door that hasn't been opened in a while. He didn't look up. "Can you show me which feed she usually goes to?" Eliza asked. He looked up then, briefly, confused. "Why?" "Because sometimes they stop eating one thing and will eat another. It doesn't always mean what you think it means." It wasn't exactly true. She wasn't a doctor for chickens, and the hen looked genuinely bad. But there was a 40% chance she was right, and a 100% chance that doing something was better than standing here watching Owen watch his hen give up. She'd learned that much about children from Adele's daughters. Sometimes the point was the attempt, not the outcome. Owen showed her the feed. They tried 3 different things. The hen ate from the third, slowly, with the fragile interest of something that hadn't entirely decided yet. Owen watched this with an expression that was too controlled for a 6-year-old, which meant he was working very hard to not show what he was feeling. "She might be okay," Eliza said. "But I don't know for certain." "Okay," Owen said. He went back to the house. But that evening at supper, he sat 1 chair closer to Eliza than he had the night before, and she decided to notice that without making anything of it. Silas noticed too. She could tell by the way he didn't say anything. By the end of the first week, she had established what might generously be called a rhythm. Not a comfortable one. She wasn't comfortable, not exactly, and she would have been suspicious of herself if she were. She'd arrived here in flight, running from a town that had spent 3 months dismantling her, and the reasonable expectation was that some of that damage was going to take longer than 7 days to repair. But she was working. She was eating meals she'd cooked herself. She was sleeping, not perfectly, not without the sudden night waking that had become routine, but sleeping nonetheless, in a real bed in a room of her own, with a window that faced the mountains instead of an alley wall. The mountains were worth looking at in the morning. She hadn't entirely planned to let herself think so, but they were. What she hadn't anticipated was Silas himself. She'd expected someone capable but remote, a man who had made a practical arrangement and intended to keep it practical. And he was that, in most respects. He didn't make conversation for its own sake. He didn't ask her questions about herself beyond what was necessary for the running of the household. He worked from before dawn until after dark, came in dirty and bone-tired, ate what she cooked with genuine appreciation but minimal ceremony, and went to bed at an hour that would have struck most people as almost aggressive in its earliness. But she caught him, on the sixth evening, standing in the doorway of the front room where Owen had fallen asleep on the rug near the stove. Not doing anything. Just watching his son sleep, with an expression on his face that was so unguarded she felt like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. It lasted maybe 4 seconds before he bent down, lifted Owen without waking him, and carried him to bed. When he came back through the kitchen, he glanced at Eliza, and she could see the small recalibration in his expression, the return of the careful, self-contained look he wore during the day. "He sleeps better when it's warm," Silas said. "I'll keep the stove later," she said. He nodded, and that was all. But she went to bed that night thinking about the 4 seconds she wasn't supposed to see, and what they meant about what this man was actually carrying, and she told herself firmly to stop thinking about it because she was here for 2 weeks, and she had enough of her own weight to manage without borrowing anyone else's. The second week started on a Monday and announced itself with 2 things: the first real snowfall of the season and Harlan Greed's man on the road. The snow she'd expected. The sky the night before had that particular flat gray quality that anyone who'd grown up in Wyoming learned to read the way other people read words on a page. She'd laid in extra wood before dark and told Silas, and he'd nodded in a way that said he'd already had the same thought. The man on the road she hadn't expected, though maybe she should have. His name was Cole Pruitt, and he worked for Harlan the way a shadow works, present, useful, doing things that let the man casting it keep his hands clean. He came by horse in the mid-morning when Silas was out with the cattle and Eliza was alone in the house with the children. He didn't come to the front door. He came to the kitchen door, which was either a social calculation or a threat, and the line between those 2 things was thin enough that she felt it. She opened the door. Pruitt was in his 40s, lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that were always taking inventory. He looked at her the way Harlan's people had learned to look at her, like she was already a settled question. "Mr. Greed wanted me to check on the Boone place," he said. He did not say why Harlan Greed would have any business checking on the Boone place. "It's fine," Eliza said. "Looks like you're still here." His voice was mild. The mildness was the threat. "Looks like." He glanced past her into the kitchen, his eyes moving across it the way they'd moved across her. "Mr. Greed has some concerns," he said, "about the well-being of those children." The cold that came through the open door was substantial, but it wasn't the reason Eliza's jaw tightened. "The children are fine," she said. "Mr. Greed feels that a woman of your reputation might not be the most appropriate person to be caring for 2 young—" "Mr. Pruitt," she said. He stopped. "You tell Harlan Greed that if he has a concern about these children's well-being, he's welcome to come and say it himself instead of sending someone else to say it for him." She looked at him steadily. "And tell him I said that in those exact words." Pruitt's inventory eyes went flat. "That might not be wise." "It's the honest thing," she said. "I've found that tends to bother some people." She closed the door. Her hands were shaking when she set them on the kitchen counter, but they were shaking with anger rather than fear, and she recognized the difference. The fear version she knew well. It went cold and dropped you into your stomach. This was hot and had its feet on the ground, and she breathed through it until it settled. Hazel was sitting at the kitchen table with a book, and she had very clearly heard every word through the door. "That was one of Harlan Greed's men," Hazel said. Not a question. "Yes. He came here before, after Papa was late on a lease payment 2 years ago." Her voice was measured in the way of someone reporting weather. "He stood in the yard and talked loud enough that we could hear him inside." Eliza turned around. "What did he say?" Hazel looked at her directly. "He said Papa should be careful about what he was building and who he was trusting, because things burn." The room went very quiet. "Hazel," Eliza said carefully, "did your father report that to anyone?" "He reported it to himself," Hazel said, with the particular weariness of a 9-year-old who has been paying too much attention to adult problems for too long. "That's what he does with things. He puts them somewhere inside and they sit there." Eliza thought about the 4 seconds in the doorway, the expression she wasn't supposed to see. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me." Hazel looked at her for a moment. "You're not going to leave because of this," she said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of someone who had asked that question silently so many times that it had started to leak out. "I told your father 2 weeks," Eliza said. "I keep my word." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise about anything beyond the immediate term. But Hazel's shoulders did something subtle, and she went back to her book, and Eliza turned back to the stove. When Silas came in that evening, she told him about Pruitt, directly and without softening it. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which she'd noticed was a consistent habit of his. He didn't manage incoming information by inserting himself into it. He just took it in first and thought about it second, which struck her as unusual and decent. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He mentioned the children," Silas said. "Yes." She watched him process that. The part of him that was a father processed it differently than the part of him that was a man dealing with a business threat, and she could see both of them working, separately, before he pulled them back together. "He's not going to take this any further through Pruitt," he said. "If Harlan wanted to actually move, he'd move." This was a message. "I know," Eliza said. I sent one back." Something shifted in his expression. "What did you say?" She told him. He was quiet again for a different kind of moment. "That was either very brave or very inadvisable," he said. "Probably both," she admitted. He almost smiled. She saw it start and then get controlled, which was something she was starting to recognize in him. The smile he didn't quite let himself have. "Yeah," he said. "Probably both." They ate dinner with the snow coming down outside and the children quieter than usual. And afterward, Hazel helped clear the table, which she hadn't done before without being asked. Owen handed Eliza his plate with something approaching deliberateness, like it was a decision he'd made rather than a reflex. Silas noticed, and the noticing went across his face the way light goes across water, briefly, completely, and then it was gone. That night, Eliza lay awake again, which was normal, but what she was thinking about was different than the nights before. Not Red Creek. Not Harlan's voice in the mercantile. Not Adele's back room. She was thinking about what Hazel had said, that things burn, and about the way Silas had said he puts them somewhere inside and they sit there, except that Hazel had said that about Silas himself, in almost exactly those words. And Eliza had thought it about Silas, and the overlap felt significant in a way she wasn't ready to unpack. She was also thinking, with the honest part of her brain that operated best at midnight, that she had told Hazel she kept her word, and that was true. 2 weeks was the word she'd given. But the 2 weeks ended in 4 days, and she had not thought once, not seriously, not in the way she had in those first hours of the wagon ride north, about what she was going to after them. Laramie still existed. $43 and some coins were still in the bottom of her brown leather bag, which she had not unpacked, she realized. She had left it packed. Not consciously, not as a statement. She had simply never unpacked it. She thought about that for a while in the dark. The next morning, something happened that rewrote the rest of the week. Eliza was in the barn. She had gone to check on the chickens. The sick hen was still eating, improving by small degrees, and she had started to feel something proprietary about this small recovery. And she had ended up staying longer than planned because one of the barn cats had found a way into the feed storage and scattered grain across 3 shelves and the floor. She was cleaning it up, making more noise than she intended, which is why she didn't hear Silas come in and why she didn't know he was standing there until he said her name. Except he didn't say it in the ordinary way. He said it the way you say something when you've been standing somewhere long enough to think first and have decided to say the difficult thing. "Eliza." She turned around. He was standing near the door, hat in his hands, which she had come to recognize as the posture he took when he was going to say something he'd prepared. It was the same posture he'd had on Adele's back step. Coat dark with early morning, hat off, something deliberate in the way he held himself. "I know the 2 weeks is almost up," he said. 4 days? She said. "Right." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I'm not going to try to change what you've decided. That's your business, and I respect it." He looked up. "But I want to tell you something before you go because I think you should know it." She waited. "When Harlan Greed started in on you, 3 months ago, I heard about it. Inside of the first week, I'd heard most of what he was saying. He paused. I knew it wasn't true. Not because I knew you. I didn't. But because I know how Harlan operates, and I know what a man sounds like when he's punishing someone for refusing him. His jaw tightened. And I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I had enough of my own, that someone else would say it. No one did, Eliza said. No one did, he agreed, and he said it flat, without excusing it. I've thought about that a lot. More than I've told anyone. He turned the hat in his hands. What I'm saying is, the work you've done here has been worth more than I'm paying you. A lot more. And if you choose to leave in 4 days, you'll be leaving somewhere better than where I found you, which is not because of anything I gave you. That was all your own doing, but I want you to know I see it clearly. What you are, and what they said about you. And if my word means anything to anyone in this county, I'll say it publicly and I'll keep saying it. She was not going to let this turn into something she cried about. She had made that rule early in her time at the ranch, not as suppression, but as survival. She was not going to spend her limited energy crying over things that were trying to restore her when crying was a thing she'd had to save for the things that were destroying her. Thank you, she said. Her voice was level. I'm not finished, he said. She looked at him. I'd like you to stay, he said. Past the 2 weeks, for as long as you're willing. Not because I need the help, though I do, and not because the children need it, though they do. He stopped. Because you belong here more in 12 days than some people belong in a place they've lived their whole lives. And I think somewhere you know that, and I think it scares you worse than Harlan Greed does. The silence that followed was the longest Eliza had experienced since coming to the ranch. That's a presumptuous thing to say, she said finally. Yes, ma'am, he said. I've been thinking about how to say it for 4 days, and I couldn't find a less presumptuous version. Despite herself, despite everything, something that was almost a laugh moved through her. Not quite making it out, but detectable. She looked at this man with his turned hat and his 2 days' worth of jaw and his gray-brown tired eyes, and she thought, he is not offering you rescue. He is not offering you pity. He is offering you the honest assessment of what he sees and leaving the decision where it belongs. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded, put his hat on, 2 fingers, the period, and went back out to his work. She stood in the barn for another few minutes, listening to the grain shift under her feet and the cold outside do what cold did. The sick hen made a small sound from her corner. Still alive, still eating, still doing the daily, unglamorous work of not giving up. Eliza picked up the spilled grain, put it back where it belonged. The 2 days after that were different in a way she couldn't have named if someone asked her to. Nothing changed outwardly. The work was the same, the rhythms the same, the children the same. But she noticed things she hadn't noticed before with the same careful attention. The way Owen had started sitting in the kitchen while she cooked, not talking, not demanding anything, just present. The way Hazel had started bringing her books, not to show off, but to ask questions, real questions, the kind a bright child asks when they've decided the person across from them might have a real answer. The way the house, which had felt like someone else's life when she arrived, had started to feel like the space around a shape that might be hers. She didn't unpack her bag, but on the second to last night, she took it from under the bed and set it on the chair. She didn't unpack it, but she opened it. She looked at what was inside. The folded things, the coins, the single small book she'd carried since she was 18. She had packed all of this in the dark, with her hand on a doorknob, thinking she was ending something. She had been ending something. She just hadn't understood yet what she was beginning at the same time. And then, on the last morning, the morning that would have been her last, Hazel came down before breakfast, which she did not ordinarily do, and she sat at the kitchen table while Eliza worked, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "If you leave today, Owen is going to stop talking again." Eliza kept her hands on what she was doing. "You think so?" "I know so." Hazel's voice was controlled in the way it always was when she was trying to keep something from cracking. "He talked to you about the hen. He talked to me about you talking to him about the hen. He asked me at dinner last night if you were still going to be here in the spring." She paused. I didn't know what to say. Eliza set down what she was holding and turned around. Hazel was looking at the table. Her braid had come loose on one side the way it always did by morning, and there was a look on her face that was too old for her age, and also exactly the right age. 9 years old and absolutely terrified of needing something that might not stay. "What do you want, Hazel?" Eliza asked. Not the easy version of the question, the real one. The girl was quiet for so long that Eliza thought she wasn't going to answer. "I want someone who doesn't leave," Hazel said. "Not forever. I know nobody stays forever. I just want someone who doesn't leave because it got hard or because they're scared or because some man in town said something bad." She looked up. "I want someone who's here because they chose to be." Eliza looked at this 9-year-old girl who had watched too many adults make themselves the exception to their own promises. And she understood in that moment, not gradually, not as a developing realization, but all at once and with total clarity, what she had actually been doing for 12 days. Not surviving, not waiting, not marking time until Laramie. She had been choosing, she just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. She crossed the kitchen and she sat down across from Hazel and she said, "I need to go into town today." Hazel's face closed. "Not to leave," Eliza said. "I need to go into town because I left something unfinished there and I can't stay anywhere properly until I finish it." She looked at the girl steadily. "I will be back by dark." Hazel studied her. The internal ledger was running. Eliza could almost see it, calculating the odds. "Promise?" Hazel said, and then immediately looked like she wished she hadn't, because she was 9 and too old for that word, and they both knew it. "Yes," Eliza said simply. She went into town with the wagon, alone, in the early afternoon. She hadn't told Silas what she was doing because she didn't want him to come, and she thought he was smart enough to understand that without being told. Red Creek looked the same as it always had and affected her differently than it always had. She drove down Main Street and felt the particular quality of attention that followed her like a weather system. And instead of going cold inside the way she used to, she felt something closer to impatience, like a woman with somewhere to be who has stopped caring what the scenery thinks of her. She went to the Reverend's wife first. Her name was Martha Price, and she had been one of the first and most enthusiastic adopters of Harlan's story, the woman who had repeated it to 7 other women and called it concern. She was in her garden when Eliza came up the walk, and she saw Eliza coming and had just enough time to arrange her face into something appropriate before Eliza reached her. "Mrs. Price," Eliza said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to tell you something, and I'd appreciate it if you'd listen." Martha Price listened, mostly because Eliza didn't give her an option. She told the truth. All of it. What Harlan had asked her for, how she'd refused, what he'd done afterward, and what she could prove. She said it quietly and completely, without embellishment, the way you lay out evidence. Not to perform righteousness, but because the facts, in this case, were sufficient on their own. Martha Price was quiet afterward for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Eliza said. "That's why I'm telling you." It was not a triumphant moment. It was not the moment from which everything immediately improved. Martha Price was a woman who had already decided something, and deciding something different takes time and discomfort, and a particular kind of courage that some people have and some people don't. And Eliza could not know which kind Martha was. But she had said the true thing, and the true thing was now in the room, and the room would have to do something with it. She made 3 more stops. Not all of them went as well. At the banker's, she was shown the door before she finished speaking. At the dry goods store, the clerk listened and said nothing, and she couldn't tell whether that was neutrality or sympathy or simply conflict avoidance. But she said what she came to say, and she left. At the last stop, she ran into Harlan Greed himself. It wasn't planned. He was coming out of the lawyer's office on the north end of Main Street as she was walking past, and for a second they were 3 feet apart on a public boardwalk in the thin November afternoon sun, and there was absolutely nowhere to go with that except straight through it. He had not aged poorly, which was almost offensive. He was a large man, well-dressed in the way of men who spend money on the appearance of not thinking about money, with a broad, confident face that had the specific blankness of someone who had almost never experienced consequences. He looked at her the way he had in the mercantile, the look of a settled question. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was pleasant. "Mr. Greed," she said, "I heard you'd taken work out at the Boone Ranch." He said it the way you mention a curiosity, light, almost amused. Interesting choice for a man who's already got enough problems. "He seems to be managing," she said, "for now." The pleasantness in his voice did what pleasant voices do when they're covering something else. It made you feel the other thing more clearly for the contrast. I'd hate to see things get more difficult for him. He's got children to worry about. She looked at him for a long moment. A year ago, even 6 months ago, this would have gone into her chest and stayed there for weeks, turning over and over, poisoning everything. She would have spent the night reliving it, finding all the things she should have said. She would have let it be the thing that defined the conversation. "Harlan," she said, and she used his given name deliberately, and watched his face do something brief and not quite pleasant. "I've been thinking about something. You spent a lot of effort trying to make me disappear. 3 months of your time, your money. Pruitt's visits, the Reverend's wife, the banker, all of it." She tilted her head slightly. "A man doesn't do all that because he doesn't care. A man does all that because he's bothered." He said nothing. "I want you to know something," she said. "I went back into that house without your permission. I got well without your permission. And I'm going to continue doing both of those things without your permission for as long as I feel like it." She looked at him clearly, without performance, without theater. "You told that store full of people that nobody wants damaged goods. I've been thinking about that. The interesting thing is, the only person who uses that word about people is someone who thinks of people as property." She paused. "Which tells me a great deal more about you than it does about me." She walked past him. Her heart was going very fast. Her hands were not shaking. She registered both of these things and kept walking and did not look back. She was back at the ranch before dark. She had promised. Hazel was on the porch when the wagon came up the road, standing with her arms at her sides instead of crossed over her chest, which was the most open she had ever stood. And when Eliza came up the path, the girl looked at her the way you look at something you've been afraid to want. "You came back," Hazel said. "I told you I would," Eliza said. "I know." Hazel paused. "I didn't know if you would." Eliza stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at this girl. "There's a difference between not knowing and not believing," she said. "Which one was it?" Hazel thought about it seriously. "Maybe a little of both," she said. "Fair enough," Eliza said. She went inside. Silas was at the table with some ranch paperwork he'd been pretending to work on with insufficient commitment, and he looked up when she came in, and she could tell he'd spent the afternoon worrying in the precise, controlled way he did everything. Not showing it, but doing it nonetheless. "How was town?" he said. "Necessary," she said. He waited to see if there was more. "I ran into Harlan," she said. Silas set down his pen. "And?" "And I told him what I thought." She started pulling her coat off. "He didn't say much." "Did he threaten anything?" "Not explicitly." She hung the coat on the hook. "He never does explicitly. That's how he works." She turned around. "But I'm less worried about what he'll do than I was this morning." Silas studied her. "Why?" "Because I stopped letting him be the thing I'm running from," she said. "This morning I was going to leave or stay based on what scared me. I went into town because I needed to make a different decision based on something else entirely." She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at Harlan on the boardwalk, without theater, without performance. "I'm not leaving in 4 days. If that's still acceptable to you." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said. Simple. Like he'd been holding that word ready for a while. She nodded. Went to the stove to start dinner. Owen came in from outside a few minutes later, trailing cold air, and went to wash his hands without being asked, which was new. He sat in his usual chair. He looked at the stove where something was starting to smell like supper. "You're still here," he said. To the middle of the room, or to her specifically. She couldn't tell. "I'm still here," Eliza said. He nodded once, the way his father nodded, with that same economy of motion that seemed to run in the family. He picked up a biscuit from the plate she'd left on the table and ate it, and the kitchen held all 4 of them in its ordinary warmth, and nothing was resolved and nothing was fixed, and the winter outside was going to be worse than last year, and Harlan Greed still existed, and the brown leather bag was still on the chair in her room, still packed. But she was still here, and for the first time since she'd stood at Adele's back door with her hand on the knob, that felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet, which meant it was probably real. The bag stayed on the chair for 3 more days before Eliza finally unpacked it. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She didn't decide in the morning that today was the day and then do it with intention. She simply came upstairs after dinner one evening, saw the bag sitting there in the lamplight exactly where she'd put it, and thought, "This is ridiculous." Then she opened it and put her things away. The folded clothes into the drawer, the coins into the small tin she kept on the windowsill, the book onto the shelf beside the bed. And when she was done, the chair was empty and the room looked different, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and breathed. That was all. No revelation, no tearful moment of arrival. Just a woman putting her things in a drawer and acknowledging, without language, that she had stopped waiting to leave. The brown leather bag she folded and put under the bed. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't sentimental about most things, but she was honest about the fact that the bag had carried her here, and you didn't throw away the thing that carried you somewhere, even when the carrying was done. November deepened, and the snow that had come in the second week held on, the way Wyoming snow does when it's made up its mind. Not the heavy, wet snow of the lower country, but the dry, patient kind that settles into every gap and crevice and stays until spring gives it permission to go. The ranch hands, 3 of them, a quiet older man named Reuben, and 2 younger brothers called Dell and Hatch, who were too similar in personality to be anything other than related, moved through their days with the specific competence of men who had done this particular work in this particular cold for long enough that it had become reflex. They were respectful to Eliza in the careful way men are respectful when they don't quite know what category a person falls into. Not unfriendly, just watching to see how things settled before they committed. Reuben settled it, eventually, by coming to the kitchen door one afternoon and asking, without preamble, if there was coffee going. There was. She gave him a cup and he stood in the doorway. She didn't invite him in, and he didn't presume to come in, and drank it, and said, "Silas said you fixed the east window in the bunkhouse." "The rags weren't doing anything anymore," she said. "No, ma'am, they weren't." He looked at his coffee. "We appreciate it." She nodded. He gave back the cup and went out, and the next morning Dell and Hatch fixed the fence section near the north pasture that had needed attention for 2 months without being asked about it, which was as close to a social transaction as anyone on that ranch was going to get. Hazel, meanwhile, had begun to unfold in ways that were gradual and real and occasionally alarming. The alarming part was not the unfolding itself. Eliza had half expected that, once Hazel decided to extend something like trust, she would extend it completely and all at once, because that was the kind of person Hazel was. Comprehensive, total, binary. What Eliza hadn't expected was what came with it. The questions. Hazel asked questions the way other children breathe, constantly, without self-consciousness, with a relentless forward momentum that took you from simple to complicated in about 45 seconds flat. "Why did Harlan Greed lie about you?" Hazel asked one morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-mended sock she'd decided to attempt herself badly. "Because I wouldn't do what he wanted," Eliza said. "What did he want?" "He wanted me to be afraid of him," Eliza said. It was the true answer, and simple enough that it was also the right answer for a 9-year-old. Some men are like that. They need other people to be smaller so they can feel bigger. Hazel considered this, pulling the wrong thread and creating a knot she stared at with disgust. "Papa isn't like that." "No," Eliza agreed. "He isn't." "He never talks about himself," Hazel said. "Did you know that? He talks about the ranch, and the cattle, and the weather, and us, but he never talks about what he actually thinks about things." "I've noticed that," Eliza said. "Mama used to say he was the most private public person she'd ever met." Hazel looked at the knot in the sock. "I didn't understand what that meant when she said it. I think I understand it now." Eliza looked at her. "You miss her a lot." "Every day," Hazel said, plainly, without drama. "But it's different than it used to be. It used to be like a hole. Now it's more like a scar, I guess. It's still there, but it doesn't bleed anymore." 9 years old, Eliza thought, and already has better language for grief than most adults. "That's exactly what it's like," she said. Hazel looked up, and the look on her face was the look of someone who has said a true thing and had it confirmed, which is a particular kind of relief. "Have you lost someone?" she asked. "My parents," Eliza said. "A long time ago. Not the same as what you went through, but yes, I know the whole." Hazel nodded, satisfied in the way she got satisfied when an answer was real rather than careful. She went back to her sock. She made the knot worse. She looked at it, then at Eliza. "I'm going to need help with this," she said. "Yes?" Eliza said. You are. Owen's progress moved at his own pace, which was slower and less linear than his sister's and more honest about it. He had bad days when he retreated back into the particular silence that Silas had described, the silence that was not peaceful, but held, like breath. And on those days Eliza left him alone and did not interpret it as failure, her own or his. She had learned, in the weeks she'd been here, that the worst thing you could do to a child who was managing something large and private was try to manage it for them. But the good days were worth the bad ones. He started talking to her about the animals, not just the sick hen, who had made a full and slightly improbable recovery and was now the most aggressive occupant of the chicken coop, but all of them. He knew each horse individually, not by name, but by character. He could tell her which one got nervous in close spaces, and which one would work through a headwind without complaint, and which one had a tendency to test the fence when Silas wasn't watching. He knew the cattle the same way. He carried this knowledge around like a full cup he hadn't had anyone to pour it into. She asked him questions because she actually wanted to know. That was the part that worked, she thought. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a technique for drawing out a quiet child. She was genuinely interested, and Owen knew the difference between genuine and performed with the accuracy of someone who'd had to learn it young. One afternoon, out by the barn, he said without any preamble, "You're not like the others." "What others?" she asked. "The women who came to help before." He was looking at the horses. "Mrs. Clifton talked to us like we were going to break. The one before her, Mrs. Aldridge, she talked to Hazel too much and me not at all, like she'd decided which one of us was worth it." He paused. "You just talk to us like regular." "You are regular," Eliza said. He thought about that. "Hazel says you're staying." "That's the plan," she said. "Plans change," he said. It was not accusatory. It was just the observation of someone who had seen plans change. "They do," she agreed, "but some plans are more solid than others. This one's getting more solid." He looked at her then, directly, the way he rarely did. "How do you know?" he asked, and it was such a genuine question, with such a real amount of six-year-old uncertainty underneath it, that she felt it somewhere behind her ribs. "Because I unpacked my bag," she said. He thought about that for a moment. "Your brown one?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, working through the logic of it. Then, "Okay," he said, and went back to looking at the horses, apparently satisfied. That night at dinner, he told Silas, completely without context. She unpacked her bag. Silas looked at Eliza over Owen's head. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, and the moment passed the way moments do when they're carrying more than they know how to hold, and the supper went on. It was 2 days after that when Harlan Greedy came to the ranch himself. She'd half expected it after the boardwalk. Harlan was not a man who absorbed a loss quietly. She knew enough of him to know that being spoken to the way she'd spoken to him would require a response, and Pruitt's quiet messages were the kind of thing a man used to soften ground before he walked on it himself. She had told herself she was ready. She had thought she understood what ready meant. What she had not prepared for was the audience. He didn't come alone. He brought Pruitt and 2 other men she didn't recognize, big-shouldered and deliberately placed, and he brought the town lawyer, a man named Aldous Beck, who had a face like a closed door and a reputation for finding legal ground, where most people couldn't see any. He brought all of this to the front of the Boone Ranch on a Thursday morning when the sky was the flat gray of serious weather and Silas was in the far north pasture and the ranch hands were with him. Eliza was alone in the house with the children. She heard the horses first. She went to the front window, saw them coming up the road, counted them, and made a series of rapid decisions in about 4 seconds. She turned to Hazel, who had come to the window beside her. "I need you to take Owen upstairs," she said. "What's happening?" Hazel's voice was flat in the way it got when she was scared and not showing it. "Harlan Greed is here," Eliza said. "I need to talk to him, and I need you somewhere you can hear what's happening without being in it. Can you do that?" Hazel looked at the men coming up the road and at Eliza and did her internal calculation. "Yes," she said. "Take the book you were reading. Stay in your room, unless I call you." Hazel took Owen's hand, Owen, who had seen the men out the window and gone very still, and they went upstairs. Eliza heard them at the top, heard the click of Hazel's door, heard it not quite close all the way. Good girl, she thought. She put on her coat. Then she went out the front door and onto the porch and stood there, in the cold, before they reached the steps. She was not going to have this conversation from inside, where she would be receiving them. She was going to have it from the porch, in the open, where the terms were hers. Harlan pulled his horse up at the bottom of the steps and looked at her with the same blankness as the boardwalk, the same pleasant expression that was a container for something else entirely. "Miss Mercer," he said, "is Mr. Boone available?" "He's working," she said. "What do you need?" Harlan looked at the lawyer, then back at her. "The matter I've come about is for Mr. Boone." "Then come back when he's here," she said, the pleasantness thinned by a degree. "It's a time-sensitive matter." "Most things are," she said. "Come back this evening." Pruitt shifted his horse slightly, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that was less about the horse and more about reminding you that he was there and larger than you. Eliza looked at him directly, which was the only response that made any sense. Looking away would give him the thing he was trying to take. "We have a concern," Harlan said, pulling her attention back to himself with the smooth ease of a man practiced at controlling rooms, "about the welfare of the children on this property." "You mentioned that," she said, "through Pruitt." I gave him my answer. "Miss Mercer." He said her name the way he'd said it in the mercantile, not as a name but as a classification. "I think you understand that your presence here is irregular. A woman of your standing, alone with a widower and his children, without proper arrangement." "There is a proper arrangement," she said. "I am employed here. The arrangement is between me and Mr. Boone, and it is his business and mine." "The community has an interest in the welfare of children," Aldous Beck said. He had not spoken until now, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to make power sound like reason. "Particularly fatherless children in the care of someone whose reputation—" "My reputation," Eliza said, "was manufactured by the man standing beside you, on the basis of refusing his personal request. I believe you know this, Mr. I believe several people in this county know this, and I believe the fact that Harlan is using the welfare of 2 children as a vehicle for this conversation tells you everything you need to know about how legitimate his concern actually is." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences she'd been navigating. This one had weight and edges. Harlan's pleasant expression was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not anger exactly. It was the specific cold of a man who has decided that the social rules he usually operates within are not going to serve him here and is recalculating. She had seen it on the boardwalk, the beginning of it, when she'd used his given name. This was the full version. "I would be careful," he said, "about making accusations you can't support." "I'm not making accusations," she said. "I'm telling you what I know. There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. "You asked me in November of last year to accompany you to your property in Crestfall under the pretense of looking at fabric samples for your wife's sitting room. When I declined, you told me I'd regret it. Inside of a week, you'd spoken to Martha Price, Henry Aldrich at the bank, Reverend Cale, and at least 4 other people in this town." She paused. "I have a list, Mr. Greed. Names, dates, what was said. I've been keeping it since the 3rd week." She did not actually have a formal list. She had a very good memory and the kind of mind that cataloged things under pressure, and she had a strong suspicion that the implicit threat of specificity was more effective than the specificity itself, because it would cost him time and uncertainty to test whether she was bluffing. From inside the house, something moved on the stairs. A creak, then stillness. Hazel, repositioning. Harlan looked at the house, then back at Eliza. His eyes were doing the inventory thing that Pruitt's eyes did, calculating what was here, what could be used, what the angles were. "Silas Boone has been behind on his lease arrangement with the Valley Water Authority for 2 years, he said. The shift was abrupt and deliberate, a change of ground when the first ground wasn't holding. The authority has been patient, that patience has limits." There it was. She had been waiting for it in some form, the thing that was actually under all the child welfare language, the real mechanism. Silas had mentioned the water arrangement once, briefly, in the context of the ranch's finances. Not in distress, but honestly, the way he was honest about most things. He was managing. But managing and comfortable were different, and in a dry year, access to water was the difference between a cattle ranch surviving and not. And Harlan Greed, it appeared, had a relationship with the Valley Water Authority. Of course he did. "I think you should come back this evening," Eliza said again. Her voice was level. She was working hard to keep it level. When Mr. Boone can speak for himself. Tell him, Harlan said, gathering his reins, that the authority will be reviewing active arrangements at the end of the month, and that arrangements can be renegotiated based on a variety of factors. He let that sit for a moment, including the character and standing of the people involved in a leaseholding household. He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and Pruitt and the other two men followed, and Beck the lawyer came last, and she stood on the porch and watched them go all the way to the road, and then she put her hand against the porch post because her legs had decided to be honest about the past 15 minutes in a way her face had not. The front door opened behind her. Hazel came out onto the porch, book in hand as instructed, face doing the careful thing. I heard, Hazel said. I know, Eliza said. The water arrangement, Hazel said. That's how he got the Halverson family. Papa told me. He found a way to make the terms change. She paused. Papa's going to be upset. Your father, Eliza said, straightening up, is going to be a lot of things when I tell him. Upset might be one of them, but he is also going to need to think clearly and make decisions, and he's better at that than almost anyone I've met. She looked at Hazel. So we're going to tell him everything, exactly as it happened, and then we're going to let him think. Hazel considered this. What if he can't fix it? Then we figure out what else to do, Eliza said. Together? The word came out of Hazel with a casualness that was practiced enough to be real. She'd trained herself not to want things too loudly, but the wanting was there underneath it, clear as anything. Together, Eliza said. Silas came in at dusk, cold and tired in the particular way of a man who has been working outside in pre-storm weather, which takes something out of you that regular cold doesn't. He came in through the kitchen, the way he always did, and stopped when he saw Eliza's face. He was good at reading rooms. She had noticed this early, the way he walked in and immediately calibrated to whatever the atmosphere was, without asking, without demanding anyone explain it to him. It was the quality of a man who had spent years being responsible for things that couldn't speak. What happened? He said. Not a question. She told him. She told him everything, in order, the way she'd told Hazel she would. The men arriving, the child welfare language, the water authority, what Harlan had said, what she had said back. She told him about the list she'd implied she had. He listened to the whole thing. He did not interrupt once. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Owen had stopped eating and was watching his father with the particular watchfulness of a child who takes readings off adults the way other people check weather. Silas sat back in his chair. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. The water authority, he said. The water authority, he said. He's on the board. Has been for 3 years. He said it to himself as much as to her, something clicking into place that had been sitting separately. I always thought the board was... He always seemed like one voice among several. He was quiet again. 3 years. Can you go to the other board members? Eliza asked. 2 of them owe Harlan money, he said. I know because they've told me. Not directly, but... He stopped. The third one, Walt Drury, is honest. But one honest man on a board of 3 is still one man. What about the lease arrangement itself? She asked. Is there another water source? Creek to the north runs dry by August in a bad year, he said. The Valley Authority is what we need, she thought. Then we need to change what Harlan has to work with, she said. He came here today because he thought he could move you by threatening the children and the water arrangement and my reputation, in that order. He's been successful with those tools before because people are alone when he uses them. Silas looked at her. What if you weren't alone? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Who did you have in mind? Walt Drury, to start, she said. If he's honest, he deserves to know what Harlan is doing with the board's authority. And Martha Price spoke to me yesterday. She came by the mercantile when I was getting flour. She said she'd been thinking about what I told her. She paused. I don't know what she's going to do with the thinking, but she's thinking. Martha Price has social standing in this town that Harlan can't touch, Silas said slowly. If she started talking differently about what happened to you, it might not change the water arrangement, Eliza said, but it changes what Harlan has to work with. He's been operating on the assumption that I'm invisible, that what he said about me is settled fact. She looked at Silas. It's not settled. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she was starting to be able to read. Not the surface expressions, those she'd had from early on, but the deeper ones, the ones that were about what he was actually feeling rather than what he was managing. "You went into town before," he said, "after the 2 weeks. You went and said what you said to Harlan and to Martha Price." He paused. "I didn't ask you about all of it. I figured it was yours to carry." "It was," she said. "But you're carrying mine now too," he said. "You carried mine first," she said. "You came to that back door before sunrise. You put your word on the line for someone the whole town had decided about." She met his eyes. "I think that's how it works. People carry for each other." He was quiet for a long moment. Then quietly, "Clara used to say something like that." She did not look away. "She sounds like she was right." He nodded, once, the way he did when something landed somewhere it was going to stay. Then he looked at his children, Owen still watchful, Hazel trying to appear as though she was not listening to every word, and something in his posture shifted from the holding everything in posture to something else, something that was more tired but more honest. "All right," he said, "I'll ride to Walt Drury's tomorrow morning." "I'll write down what Harlan said today," Eliza said, "as close to exact as I can get it, in case it's useful." He nodded. "Eliza." He said her name with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. "What you did today, on that porch, alone with those men, that was not a small thing." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." "I'm not," she said. And she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and his expression did the thing where the careful look came back briefly before he let it go again. "If you'd been here, you would have handled it," she said, "and Harlan would have learned that you handle it. This way he learned something different." "What did he learn?" Silas asked. She thought about it. "That there's someone here who doesn't move," she said. The storm that had been threatening arrived 2 days later, and it arrived seriously. Eliza had grown up with Wyoming winters, so she knew the difference between a storm you prepared for and a storm you respected, and this was the second kind. It came in from the northwest on a Saturday morning, and by noon it had reduced visibility to the length of your arm and packed the wind with ice crystals that cut through layers the way the cold usually took hours to manage. Silas had seen it coming the day before. The sky had told him in the language of weather that people who work outside learn to read, and they had spent Friday preparing in the practical, undramatic way that preparation worked on a ranch. Extra wood inside, extra feed accessible without going to the far barn. The cattle moved to the south pasture where the terrain gave them some protection. Food laid in. What they hadn't prepared for was being genuinely trapped. By Saturday evening, the road south was impassable, the road north was worse, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that made you stop thinking about the number and start thinking about the immediate square feet around you. Reuben and Dell and Hatch were in the bunkhouse, which was solid and stocked, and she'd made sure of the food situation the day before. Silas, Eliza, and the children were in the main house, and the main house held. The first evening was fine, almost comfortable, in the way that extreme weather outside makes inside feel more vivid and intentional. The stove working hard, the lamps bright against the dark. Hazel doing her schoolwork at the table, and Owen arranging and rearranging a set of carved wooden animals he'd had since he was 3 and only produced on certain occasions, which Eliza had come to understand meant he was feeling young in a way he needed to allow himself. The second day was when the close quarters started doing what close quarters do. Silas was not easy to be trapped with. She had not known this about him because until now she had rarely seen him inside for more than an hour at a stretch. He was a man built for physical work and open space, and being held inside by weather he couldn't manage made him restless in a particular way. Not irritable exactly, but present in the wrong way. Too much in a room at once, picking things up and setting them down, starting conversations and stopping them, going to the window every hour to look at the snow as though looking at it would change it. On the second afternoon, she said, "Sit down, Silas." He looked at her. "You're wearing out the floor," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "I hate this," he said. "I know," she said. "There's nothing to be done about it." "The cattle?" "Reuben knows what to do," she said. "You told him yourself." He was quiet. Then, "It's not just the cattle." She waited. He looked at the window where the snow moved in the lamplight like something alive. When Clara died, it was November, he said. The weather closed in 2 days after. I was here, alone with them. He gestured toward the stairs, toward the sleeping children. And I couldn't go anywhere, and I couldn't do anything, and the whole world was just... He stopped. Snow. Oh, and the inside of this house. And 2 children who needed things I didn't know how to give them. She didn't say anything. She let him have the shape of it. I got through it, he said. I want to be clear. I got through it. We all did. But the way I got through it was by not stopping, by working until I was too tired to think, by keeping every hour of every day full of something that had to be done. He looked at her. When there's nothing to do, it comes back, all of it, the still... He searched for the word, the stillness. The stillness is the hardest part, she said. Yes, he said. Because in the stillness, you can't pretend you're fine, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was close to it. How long have you known you were doing that? What? Pretending. He shook his head. I'm not talking about me anymore, he said. I'm asking you. She considered this. Outside, the wind moved against the house with a sound like something looking for a way in, finding the seams, testing them. The stove crackled. From upstairs, the faint sound of Hazel talking to herself while she read, a habit she'd apparently had for years and saw no reason to change. A long time, Eliza said finally. I think I got so good at surviving that I confused it with living. And once you've done that for long enough, you stop being able to tell the difference. She turned the cup in her hands. The town, and Harlan, and the back room at Adele's, none of that was fine, but I kept my head above it, and I called that fine. Because fine was the only version I could afford. And now? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Now I don't know, she said. I know it's different. I know that this... She gestured, a small, frustrated gesture, at the room and the house and the implied everything, is more than surviving, but I don't have a name for it yet. He was quiet for a moment. Clara used to say I kept everything in a box, he said. She'd say it with affection. She wasn't criticizing it. She understood that was how I was built. But she used to say, Silas, one of these days that box is going to get full, and then what? He paused. She was right. She was right about most things. It sounds like she loved you clearly, Eliza said. She did, he said. And I loved her the same way. He paused. Without it being tidy. We argued. She thought I was too stubborn, and she was right. I thought she took on too much at once, and I was right. We were both right about each other. He smiled slightly, briefly, the real smile she rarely saw. She used to say the point wasn't being right. The point was staying. She held that for a moment. She sounds like she was good at this, Eliza said. At what? Being a person, she said. At all the hard parts of it. He looked at her. The firelight and the lamplight were doing something that had nothing to do with either of them, and everything to do with the season and the hour and the storm pressing against the walls, making the inside smaller and warmer and more itself. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Owen sleeping, with the guard down, with the real expression out where it could be seen, and she felt again the sensation of seeing something she wasn't supposed to see, except this time it was directed at her, and there was nowhere to redirect it. You're good at it too, he said. You don't see it because you're inside it. But from where I'm sitting, he stopped. From where I've been sitting for 6 weeks, I've watched you do hard things without making them a performance. I've watched you be kind to my children without needing them to thank you for it. I've watched you stand on that porch and speak to Harlan Greedy without flinching. He paused. And I've watched you unpack your bag. She laughed, actually laughed. The real version. Not the almost laugh she'd been producing since she arrived. Owen told you within about 4 seconds, she said. He was very pleased about it, Silas said. She shook her head. The laugh settled back into something quieter and more serious, but not in a bad way, in the way of a room that was becoming what it was supposed to be, finding its shape. Silas, she said, what happened the day Clara died? You don't have to... I know, he said. I know I don't have to. He turned his cup in his hands the same way she turned hers, and she noticed that and thought, we do things the same way without knowing it. She got sick in September. It went fast. Faster than anyone told us it would. He kept his eyes on the cup. I was in the North Field when it happened. Reuben came to get me. I was too late. He paused, and the pause had a quality of held weight that she recognized from her own middle-of-the-night hours. I've never been able to. I don't think about it as often as I used to. But in the still hours, it comes back, the feeling of being in the wrong place. You weren't in the wrong place, she said. You were doing what you were supposed to be doing. I know that, he said. Most of the time I know that. He finally looked up. It's harder to know it in the still hours. Yes, she said simply. They sat in the storm for another hour, and they talked. Not the way people talk to fill silence, but the way people talk when they have stopped managing the conversation and are simply in it. She told him about her parents, who had died within a year of each other when she was 19, and how the loneliness of being unmade that she'd never quite moved past. She told him about the seamstress work, what it had meant to her, not the income but the work itself, the thing she was good at that nobody had given her and nobody could entirely take. He told her about the ranch in its early years, when he and Clara had started it with almost nothing and more stubbornness than sense, how it had almost failed twice and held on a third time through a combination of luck and refusal. He told her about the thing he wanted for his children that he could not entirely articulate, something past survival, past functional, past fine. What is it? She asked. If you had to say it. He thought for a long time. I want them to know what it feels like to be in a place that chooses them back, he said finally. She heard it land, and she held it. I know what that means, she said. He looked at her. I know you do, he said. Outside, the storm said everything that needed saying, and inside, two people who had both learned to be careful with the things they needed sat in the lamplight and let the careful drop for a while. And it did not break anything. It held. It held the way things hold when they're built right. Not because they're perfect, but because the materials are honest and the ground underneath is solid, and whoever put them there meant for them to stay. Hazel came downstairs at some point and ate a biscuit she'd come for and went back up without saying anything. But on her way through the kitchen, she put her hand briefly on Eliza's shoulder. Barely a second, barely a touch, and went. Owen slept through all of it. The storm ran for 3 more days. The storm broke on a Wednesday. Not gently. Wyoming weather did not do things gently. It did them completely, and then it stopped doing them. And the morning after the 3rd night of the storm, Eliza came downstairs to find the wind had dropped to nothing, and the sky outside the kitchen window was the specific blue that only exists in winter. After a storm has cleaned everything, a blue so sharp and absolute it almost hurt to look at. The snow was everywhere and heavy, and the world had been rearranged by about 3 feet in every direction. But the stillness was total, and in the stillness the ranch sat solid and unchanged and exactly where it had always been. She stood at the window with her first cup of coffee and looked at it, and let herself feel, without argument, that she was glad to be looking at this particular view and not a different one. Silas was already outside. She could see his tracks in the snow going toward the barn, and then a second set coming back, and then a third going toward the bunkhouse. The record of a man who had been up for 2 hours before she came downstairs, moving through his first priorities in order. She had learned to read his tracks in the snow the way she'd learned to read other things about him. What they said was never complicated, because he wasn't complicated. He was layered, which was different. Complicated was when you couldn't figure someone out. Layered was when you could, but it took time, and what you found under each layer was consistent with what you'd found in the one before. Reuben and Dell and Hatch were alive and intact, which she'd known they would be, but was still glad to confirm when Dell came to the kitchen door an hour later, asking about breakfast with the sheepish directness of a young man who has been eating his own cooking for 4 days and is not proud of the results. She made enough for all of them, which was not strictly her job, but was the thing that made sense, and they ate at the table with the practicality of working men who were grateful and showed it by eating seriously and not making a mess. The thaw was going to take a week, at minimum. The road south remained impassable for 3 days after the storm broke, and the road north was worse. This did not distress Eliza the way it might once have. The way being trapped would have distressed her, specifically 3 months ago, when being trapped anywhere meant being trapped with her own wreckage. Now the impassable road simply meant that the valley was sealed off, and everyone in it was working through the same practical challenges, and there was something almost peaceful about that. A problem everyone had was not the same as a problem only you had. But it was during that post-storm week, when the roads were clearing and the days were getting their shape back, that things between her and Silas shifted in a way that neither of them named, but both of them felt. It had started in the storm, in those evenings by the stove where they had talked past their respective careful limits. She could feel the difference in the mornings after, not awkwardness exactly, but a new attentiveness, the quality of two people who have seen each other more honestly than intended and are not sure yet what to do with that. He would be at the table when she came down, and he would look up and say something ordinary about the weather, about the cattle, about what the day held, and she would answer in kind, and the ordinary words were fine, but underneath them something had changed in the frequency between them, the way you can hear a difference in a house after something has moved in it. She noticed she was more careful around him now, not in the guarded way she'd been careful in the first weeks, not protecting herself from him, but in the way you're careful with something you've started to value, which was a different and more complicated kind of careful. He noticed things too. She could tell because he had started doing a thing she hadn't seen from him before. He would stop in the middle of something, carrying wood, coming in from outside, sitting down to supper, and look at her for a second, just a second, before whatever he was doing required his attention again. She tried not to read too much into it. She was very aware of her own tendency to interpret kindness as more than kindness, which was a habit she'd developed in leaner times and hadn't entirely undone. Owen was the one who named it, inevitably. He was 6, and 6-year-olds do not manage subtext. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the storm, and Eliza was at the kitchen table working on a repair to Silas's best coat, the one he wore for town, which had a lining that had started separating at the shoulder. Owen was doing his schoolwork at the other end of the table, which was new. He'd started doing his schoolwork in the same room as Eliza rather than upstairs alone, which Hazel had pointed out to Eliza with the tone of someone reporting a significant data point. He worked quietly for a while. Eliza sewed quietly. Outside, Silas and Reuben were moving a load of timber from the east barn, and you could hear them occasionally. A word, the sound of something set down, footsteps in packed snow. "You like Papa," Owen said. Eliza did not stop sewing. "I think your father is a good man," she said. "That's not what I meant," Owen said. She looked up at him then. He was watching her with the patient directness of someone who has decided that adults make the simple things complicated and is waiting for her to catch up. His pencil was resting on his school book, and he looked utterly certain of what he'd said and unbothered by saying it. "Owen," she said. "He likes you too, he said helpfully. "He looked at you all during supper last night, and he didn't know I was watching him." She opened her mouth and then closed it. She set the coat down on the table. She looked at this 6-year-old who was watching her with the settled confidence of someone who has seen something clearly and is simply reporting the fact of it. "You're going to be a very interesting person to have around when you're older," she said. He looked pleased. "Hazel says I should mind my own business," he said. "Hazel is often right," Eliza said. "But I'm right too," he said, and picked up his pencil and went back to his schoolwork. She picked up the coat and went back to the lining and did not think about it firmly until Owen went out to the barn an hour later, and then she thought about it quite a bit. It was 2 days after that conversation, on a Saturday morning, that the woman appeared at the road. Eliza saw her first. She was coming in from the chicken coop, the recovered hen now. Queen of the coop and ruling it accordingly. And there was a figure on the road at the edge of the property, standing with a carpet bag, not moving. The snow on the road had been partially broken by wagon traffic since the thaw, but only partially, and the walking was difficult, and the woman was standing still in a way that suggested she had been walking for a long time and had run out of what it takes to keep going. Eliza went to the road. The woman was older than her by about 15 years, with a face that had been through something recent and severe. She was not dressed for the cold the way you dressed when you planned to be outside in it. Her coat was adequate for town, not for this, and her hands were bare. She was holding the carpet bag with both hands in front of her the way people hold things when the holding of it is the only certain thing left. "Are you all right?" Eliza asked. The woman looked at her. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been asked that question after a long time of no one asking it, and who doesn't quite know what to do with it. "I don't know where I'm going," she said. Her voice was steady, but thin. "I was in Red Creek, and I was going to take the North Road, but the storm closed it, and I ended up... I've been walking since yesterday morning." "Since yesterday morning," Eliza said. "Not alarm." She moved past alarm quickly because alarm was not useful, but an immediate internal accounting of the situation. "What's your name?" "Nora," she said. "Nora Fenn." "Come inside, Nora Fenn," Eliza said. She did not ask anything else until the woman was inside, until there was hot coffee in her hands, and she'd been close to the stove long enough for the color to come back into her face and the shaking to settle. Hazel, who had been reading in the front room and had the Hazel-specific ability to appear exactly when something was happening without making it about herself, came to the kitchen doorway, looked at the woman, looked at Eliza, and went silently to get a blanket. Silas came in an hour later to find a woman he'd never seen sitting at his kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, drinking coffee. To his credit, his expression moved through the sequence of surprise, assessment, and practical acceptance in about 4 seconds. And he said to Eliza, "She walked in?" "From the road," Eliza said. He looked at Nora Fenn, who was watching him the way people watch someone when they're trying to determine very quickly whether they're safe. "Ma'am," he said, "you're welcome here until you can get where you're going." Nora Fenn's face did something that was briefly, completely unguarded. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. "Thank you," she said, in the voice of someone who is not used to accepting help and is learning to do it in real time. Her story came out in pieces over the rest of that day, as stories do when they belong to someone who has learned to be careful with them. She had been married to a man in Red Creek. Eliza knew the name when Nora said it, knew it in the way she knew most things about that town now, through the osmosis of having survived it. He had died in October, and what he'd left behind was not what she'd believed he had, and the house and the debt had required each other, and by November she had nothing and nowhere, and the kind of pride that made accepting other people's pity feel worse than the cold. She'd heard there was work north, in the larger ranches toward the territorial border. She had no clear information about this beyond having heard it said once by a man she didn't entirely trust, which she admitted without embarrassment. "You don't actually know if there's work north," Eliza said. "No," Nora said. "And you walked out into that on that information." "I walked out into that because staying was the alternative," Nora said, and she said it with a directness that was too tired for performance. "And I'd rather freeze moving than suffocate standing still." Eliza looked at this woman and felt something that was both recognition and something protective. She had been this woman, not in every particular but in the essential thing. The point where the going is terrible but it is still a direction, and a direction is what you need when everything else has been removed. "You can stay here," Eliza said, "for the immediate term." Nora looked at her, then at Silas, who was at the counter and had been listening. "I don't take charity," Nora said. "It's not charity," Eliza said. "There's plenty here that needs doing, and you'd be earning your room. I can't pay much, but neither can you get anywhere for the next week anyway. So." Silas said nothing. This was, she understood by now, his version of agreement. He trusted her read of the situation, and he let her handle it, which was different from being passive, and she knew the difference. Nora looked at her hands. "All right," she said. Hazel appeared in the doorway again. She had brought a second blanket at some point without being asked, which was the kind of thing Hazel did. Practical generosity, unannounced, offered through action rather than language. "The room next to mine has a good stove," Hazel said to Nora Fenn. "I'll show you." Nora Fenn looked at this 9-year-old girl who had just offered her shelter with the same matter-of-fact authority she applied to most things, and her expression did the thing again, the briefly unguarded thing. "Thank you," she said. That night, after Nora had been settled and the children were in bed, Silas came and found Eliza in the kitchen where she was still up, going over the household accounts she'd started keeping 3 weeks ago, when she noticed that the ranch's food stores were being managed somewhat optimistically. He sat across from her without asking whether she was too busy, which meant he had something to say. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "About Nora?" "You saw a woman on the road and you brought her in," he said. "Without asking me, without—" He paused. "Without any of the hesitation I would have had." She looked at him. "You would have done the same." "I'd like to think so," he said. "But I'd have thought about it first, whether it was my place, whether it would be inconvenient, whether—" He stopped. "You didn't think about any of that." "I thought about it," she said. "I thought about it in about 1 second, and then I decided." She put down the pencil she'd been using. 6 weeks ago, someone opened a door for me when I had nowhere to go. I don't think I get to do anything different when someone else is standing at my road. He was quiet for a long moment. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I came to Adele's door, he said, I told you it was about work, that I needed help with the ranch and the children, and those things were true. He put his hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was being deliberate. But they weren't all of it. Silas, let me finish, he said. Not with force, but with the steady intention of someone who has prepared something and means to say it. I'd been watching this town for 3 months, watching what Harlan did to you, and watching people let him, and watching you hold your head up anyway, and keep coming to the mercantile, and keep being visible when it would have been easier not to be. He paused. I told you I came because I needed help. That was true. But I also came because I had been thinking about you for 3 months, and not in the way of feeling sorry for you. He looked at her directly. In the way of thinking, that woman is made of something real, and I couldn't watch you disappear into that suitcase without... He stopped again. I didn't have the right to say any of that then, so I said the part I had the right to say. The kitchen held the two of them. The stove was burning low, the lamps were at their evening level, and outside the Wyoming night was cold and clear and indifferent in the way of places that have existed longer than people and will exist longer still. She heard what he'd said. She let it sit in the room and she looked at it honestly rather than immediately figuring out what to do with it, because she had learned in the past 6 weeks that her instinct was to do something with things before she'd fully felt them, and that instinct was not always her friend. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. I want to be honest with you about that. What part? He said. This part, she said, whatever this is. She gestured between them, the inadequate gesture she'd made in the storm. I spent a long time being someone that no one chose. And then I spent a long time choosing to be alone because it was safer than being unchosen again. And now, she stopped. Now I'm here and I'm unpacked and I'm not going anywhere and you just told me something that I would have... She pressed her lips together. 3 months ago, I would have told myself I'd imagined it, that I wanted to hear it, so I heard it wrong. And now? He said. Now I believe you, she said, and that's scarier than not believing you. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I know exactly what that's like. He turned his cup in his hands. I didn't plan to care about anyone again. I mean that without any... He shook his head slightly. It wasn't a decision I made. It was something that happened while I was watching someone fix things. While I was watching someone stand on a porch and not flinch. He looked at her. While I was watching someone unpack a bag. Despite herself, despite the weight of the moment, something moved in her face. Owen told you in 4 seconds, she said. He was very proud of his information, Silas said. She shook her head. The smile settled, and underneath it something that was quieter and more serious and more scared than the smile. And she looked at this man who had come to a back door before sunrise with his hat in his hands and offered her something that was honest enough to be dangerous. And she said, I don't know what I'm able to give. I want to be clear about that. I don't have a good record of trusting myself about these things. I know, he said. I'm not asking you for a declaration. I'm telling you something true, so you have it. What you do with it is yours. She nodded. She looked at the accounts on the table, the practical document of a household that was becoming something, that was working, that was more solid than it had been. And then she looked at him. I'm glad you came to that door, she said. He held that for a moment. So am I, he said. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to, not right then. The kitchen was enough. The evening was enough. It was the kind of moment that didn't need to be more than it was, and leaving it that way felt like the most honest thing. It was 2 days after that when Walt Drury came to the ranch. Eliza was in the barn when she heard the horse, and she came out to find a heavy-set man in his 60s with a gray beard and the kind of unhurried manner that suggested he had long ago stopped caring what kind of impression he made on arrival. He had dismounted already and was looking at the house with the expression of someone who is working through a decision that has been sitting with him for a while. Mr. Drury, Silas said, coming around from the south fence. He did not seem surprised. He'd told her he'd ridden to Drury's property after the storm. She'd assumed that visit had produced something, but Silas did not always report the middle parts of things. Silas, Drury said. His eyes moved to Eliza, assessing without being rude about it. Miss Mercer. She was mildly surprised he knew her name, then immediately unsurprised. Walt Drury was on the Water Authority board, and Harlan had used her name in the context of that board's business, and information traveled in this county whether you wanted it to or not. "Come in," she said, because Silas's hospitality instinct was functional but slow, and the man had ridden out in cold that still had some edge to it. They sat at the kitchen table. The table that had become the place where everything happened on this ranch, she'd noticed. It was the geographical center of gravity, and Drury put his hands around a coffee cup and got to it without preamble. "Harlan called a board meeting last week," he said. "While the roads were still bad, it was a short notice, and I barely made it, and I suspect that was somewhat intentional. The meeting was about reviewing lease arrangements in the valley, with specific attention to," he looked at Silas, "holdings with outstanding account balances." "Which includes mine," Silas said. "Yes." Drury wrapped his hands tighter around the cup. He proposed a renegotiation clause. Essentially, any leaseholder more than 60 days behind on fees could be required to undergo a character review, let's call it. A vague term, and deliberately so. It gives the board latitude to weigh factors beyond the financial. "Factors like the people living in a leaseholding household," Eliza said. Drury looked at her. "He didn't name you, but the structure of what he was proposing made the target clear to anyone who was paying attention." He paused. "I objected." "And?" Silas said. "And I was overruled 2-1. Drury set down the cup. "Which means the renegotiation clause is going to pass at the next formal session, which is in 3 weeks, unless something changes." Silas was quiet. Eliza watched his face do the thing where it went still when he was working through something large. "What changes it?" Eliza asked. Drury looked at her with something that was close to approval. "The other board member who supports Harlan on this is a man named Carroll. Theodore Carroll. He supported Harlan 2 years ago on the Halverson situation, and he's been supporting him ever since." He paused. "Carroll's position has always been based on the assumption that Harlan is the most powerful entity in this valley, and that alignment with him is the safe choice." He picked up his cup again. "What Carroll is sensitive to is public opinion. He is not a man of conviction. He is a man of position. And if public opinion shifted sufficiently in the next 3 weeks, I believe Carroll would find reasons to abstain from the vote." "Public opinion doesn't shift in 3 weeks," Silas said. "Not usually," Drury said. He looked at Eliza. "But usually it hasn't had help." She understood what he was saying. She also felt the weight of it. The thing being asked of her was not a small thing, not comfortable, and she was clear about that even as she was already thinking about how to do it. "Martha Price," she said. "She came to see me," Drury said. "Yesterday. She's been talking, not loudly. That's not her way. But the right people have been listening." Eliza thought about Martha Price standing in her garden, hearing the truth laid out without embellishment, saying, "I didn't know." She thought about what it cost a woman like that to change a position she'd held publicly. She thought about how that cost was real and not nothing, and should not be dismissed even if the position had been wrong. "What does she need from me?" Eliza asked. "She doesn't need anything from you," Drury said. "What she's asking for is the chance to do something about what she did. She wants to speak on your behalf at the board session, publicly." He paused. "She also wants to know if you'd be willing to speak yourself." The kitchen was very still. Silas looked at her, but he didn't say anything, which was his way of making clear this was hers. "In front of the board," she said. "And whoever comes," Drury said. "Board sessions are open. If people know there's something to come to, they come." She thought about the mercantile, the fabric bolts, Harlan's voice, loud enough for everyone, the silence that had followed, that specific complicit silence, and the spool of thread she'd set down and never paid for. She thought about the porch, standing on it without flinching. She thought about what she'd told Silas in the storm, that she'd stopped letting Harlan be the thing she was running from, that she wanted to make decisions based on something other than what scared her. "I'll think about it," she said. Drury nodded. He did not push, which made her trust him more. He drank his coffee and talked with Silas about the practical elements of the water arrangement, the numbers, the timing, what the renegotiation clause would actually mean in operational terms, and she listened and contributed, and by the time he left an hour later, she had a clearer picture of what they were actually facing. What they were actually facing was not ruin. It was not the end of the ranch or the loss of the water or the destruction of what had been built here. It was a man with a grudge and a mechanism and time to use both. Which was bad, but it was not unsurvivable, and she had already survived things that were unsurvivable, which meant she knew the difference. That evening she told Silas she would speak at the board session. I was mending harness at the kitchen table, the endless practical maintenance of a working ranch. And he set it down when she said it. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said. This is my fight, he said. The water arrangement, the board. This is about my ranch. You shouldn't have to put yourself through. Silas, she sat down across from him. You came to a back door before sunrise for someone you'd never met because you'd watched her be wronged, and you couldn't let it continue without doing something. She held his gaze. I've been here 6 weeks. Do you really think this is still yours alone? He looked at her. His expression was the open one, the one without the careful management, the one she'd seen in the storm, and that had been coming more frequently since. No, he said. I don't think that. Then let me speak, she said. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to say? The truth, she said. Just the truth, all of it, in a room full of people. She paused. It turns out that's the only thing I have that Harlan can't manufacture a version of. He picked up the harness again. He worked for a moment in silence. Then, I'll be in that room, he said. I know you will, she said. The 3 weeks between Drury's visit and the board session were the fullest weeks of Eliza's time at the ranch, and she thought afterward that this might have been because she'd stopped measuring them. Time does something different when you stop counting down. It doesn't go faster. It goes deeper. You stop moving across the surface of days and start actually living inside them, which is a different and more tiring and considerably more worthwhile way to operate. Nora Fenn stayed on. She turned out to be competent in ways she hadn't mentioned. She had run a household alone for 15 years while her husband was alive and difficult, and the skills that required were the same skills the ranch needed, adjusted for scale. She and Eliza developed a working arrangement that was not quite friendship yet, but had the feeling of friendship in its early structure, the way a building has the feeling of its final shape before it's finished. They worked alongside each other without needing to fill the air, which was the right kind of compatibility for daily shared work. Hazel attached herself to Nora Fenn with the slightly alarming speed of a child who has expanded their circle of trust and is now working with the new circumference. She asked Nora questions. She showed Nora her schoolwork. She told Nora, at length and with specificity, about the doll her mother had made that looked like something that had been in an accident. Nora Fenn listened to all of it with the attentiveness of a woman who understood that being listened to was not nothing, and that giving it to a child who needed it was one of the most solid things you could do with your time. Eliza watched this from a careful distance and felt something she had no clean word for, something grateful and complicated, the feeling of a house that is getting larger than you planned for, but in a direction you didn't know you needed. Owen watched Nora Fenn for a full week before he spoke to her. When he did, it was to show her something about one of the horses, the one that tested the fence, as it happened, who had been at it again that morning. He explained the horse's behavior with the quiet authority he always brought to animals, and Nora listened seriously and asked a real question, and Owen answered it, and that was the beginning of something between them that was its own thing and didn't require anyone else to define it. The day before the board session, Eliza could not sleep. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and listened to the ranch around her. The sounds a house makes in winter, the settling, the small complaints of timber against cold. And she thought about what she was going to do the next day, and she let herself be afraid of it. She had learned that trying to talk herself out of fear was less effective than acknowledging it and going anyway, and she was going anyway, so she might as well be honest. She was afraid of the room, of the people in it, of Harlan's face across a public space, watching her say the things she was going to say. She was afraid of what it would cost her if it didn't work. Not in the material way, but in the deeper way. The way you spend something down when you stand in a room and tell the truth, and the room decides the truth isn't worth more than the lie that's been there longer. She was also afraid of what it would cost her if it did work. Because that was the thing nobody talked about. How frightening it was when things started going right after a long time of wrong. The relief was real, but it sat next to something that felt almost like grief. The belated grief of someone finally allowed to rest, who has forgotten how, who feels the resting in their bones as a kind of ache. She was almost asleep when she heard the knock. Not a back door before sunrise knock. A quiet knock at the bottom of the stairs, which in this house was the way of announcing yourself without intruding. She got up, pulled a shawl around her, went to the hallway. Silas was at the bottom of the stairs, holding a lamp. He looked up at her and she looked down at him, and his expression was the one he kept for the things that mattered, the unmanaged one. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No," she said. "There's coffee," he said. She came downstairs. They sat at the table, their table, she thought, which was a thing she noticed and did not walk back. And they didn't talk about the board session or Harlan or the water arrangement. They talked about small things, the kind of things two people talk about when the large things are already understood. He told her about the north pasture fence that needed replacing in spring and his plan for it. She told him about the sick hen's ongoing reign over the coop. He laughed, actually laughed, the real version that she'd been hearing more frequently and still felt like a small discovery every time. She told him about Hazel's latest approach to mending, which had improved technically while becoming somehow more creative in its willingness to use whatever thread was available, regardless of color. "She mended her winter coat sleeve with green thread last week," Eliza said. "Just didn't even consider whether there was a closer color." "That's very Hazel," he said. "It is," she agreed. She looked at it when she was done and said, "Well, it's fixed," which is technically correct. He shook his head, and the fondness in his face for his daughter was uncomplicated and total, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone loves without reservation. She had not seen it often enough to be easy in its presence, but she was learning. "I'm scared," she said. "About tomorrow." She didn't need to say what she meant. He knew. "I know," he said. "I'm going anyway," she said. "I know that too," he said. He set down his cup. He looked at her across the table. "Eliza, whatever happens tomorrow, in that room, with the board, with Harlan, it doesn't change anything here." He said it quietly and absolutely. "I want you to know that before you walk in there. The ranch, the children, what's been building here. None of that depends on you being the one who fixes the public version of things. You've already done more than—" He stopped. "You've already done enough. What you do tomorrow is extra." She looked at him for a long moment. "It's not extra to me," she said. "It's the last piece of something." She paused. "I have been running from Harlan Greed for 4 months. In one direction or another, I have been moving based on where he pushed, and I am done with that." She felt it when she said it, the specific solidity of a decision that's been approaching for a long time and has finally arrived. "Tomorrow I'm not running from anything. I'm going toward something, and that's different." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It is." They sat in the kitchen for another hour, and the coffee went cold and neither of them made more, and the house held them in its winter quiet, and Nora Fenn's light went on briefly upstairs and then off, and an owl moved through the dark outside the window. And when Eliza finally went back to bed, she slept immediately, and without interruption, the deep sleep of someone who has stopped fighting the current and started swimming. She woke before sunrise, because she always did, and she lay there for 1 minute in the dark, and then she got up and got dressed and went downstairs to start the stove. She was not the same woman who had packed a brown leather bag 3 months ago and stood at a door with $43 and nowhere to go. She knew that clearly, in the morning dark kitchen, with the mountains outside the window just beginning to show themselves against a lightening sky. She was not that woman, and she could not entirely say when she had stopped being her. Not a single moment, but a series of them, small and large, chosen and unchosen, building the way things build when you stop tearing them down. She started the stove. Behind her, she heard small feet on the stairs, and Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hair standing up on one side and his wooden animals in his arms, still half asleep, drawn down by the smell of the stove starting, or simply by the particular gravity of wherever Eliza happened to be in the morning. "Today's the day," he said. "Yes," she said. He came and sat at his usual chair and arranged his wooden animals on the table in front of him, with the private logic she had never asked him to explain. He looked at her. "You're going to be fine," he said. She turned around and looked at this 6-year-old boy who 6 weeks ago had not spoken 50 words and was now making declarative statements about her emotional prospects with the certainty of someone who had thought about it and arrived at a conclusion. "How do you know?" she asked. His own words returned. He looked at his animals. He picked up the smallest one, a horse, and held it for a second. "Because you don't run," he said. "Papa runs sometimes. Hazel runs sometimes. But you don't." He set the horse down. "You just stay." She looked at him. She thought about everything that was in that word for her. All the running she'd done, the suitcase, the doorknob, the alley wall, the cold. And the morning, a man with a hat in his hands told her she mattered enough to find before sunrise. "I'm learning to," she said. He nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his animals. Outside, the mountains were coming clear in the early light, exactly where they'd always been, solid and without opinion, doing what mountains do, being the thing that stays. The board session was held in the Red Creek Town Hall, which was a building that took itself more seriously than its size warranted. 2 stories of timber with a carved lintel above the door that said, "Established 1871," as though the date lent it authority it might not otherwise have. Eliza had walked past it hundreds of times in her years in this town, and had never once been inside. Women generally weren't, unless they were there to petition for something, which was its own kind of statement about who the building thought it belonged to. She arrived with Silas. They had driven in together in the wagon, Nora staying back with the children. Hazel had argued against this arrangement with everything she had, and lost, and accepted defeat with the specific martyred dignity of a 9-year-old who knows she's been outmaneuvered fairly. Owen had given Eliza the small carved horse before she left. Just pressed it into her hand without explanation. She had put it in her coat pocket and kept her hand on it for most of the drive. The road into Red Creek felt different than it had in November. Not in any external way. The same flat approach, the same valley opening, the same buildings collecting themselves into the suggestion of a town. Different in the way that the same road feels different depending on what you're moving toward. In November, she had left Red Creek not looking back. Today, she was coming back facing forward, which changed the geometry of the whole thing. Silas drove. She sat beside him, coat buttoned to the throat, hands in her lap, watching the town come up. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered. "About the fact that 3 months ago I couldn't walk down this street without feeling like I was walking underwater, and right now I feel annoyed, mostly just annoyed." She paused. "That seems like progress." He looked at the road. "Annoyed at what?" "At the amount of time and energy I spent being afraid of something that was always, at its core, just one man who didn't like being told no." She turned the thought over. He built this whole architecture of damage, enlisted people, invented a story, leveraged every tool he had, and underneath all of it was just wounded pride. She shook her head. "That's not power. That's a man in a room throwing things because the window won't open." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Don't underestimate him in there today," he said. "Wounded pride with money and connections is still dangerous." "I know," she said. "I'm not underestimating him. I'm just done being afraid of him." She looked at the building ahead. "Those aren't the same thing." He nodded, pulled the wagon up and tied the horses, and they walked to the door together, and he held it, and she went in. The room was fuller than she'd expected. That was the first thing. She had imagined something small and procedural. The 3 board members at a table, a handful of interested parties, the formal mechanics of a local governance decision. What she found was a room with perhaps 40 people in it, standing along the walls and seated on the wooden chairs that had been brought in from the meeting room next door, talking among themselves in the particular pre-session murmur that holds a crowd before whatever they've come for begins. She scanned the room quickly. Walt Drury, already at the board table, nodded once at her. Theodore Carroll, the second board member, the one Drury said was a man of position rather than conviction, was looking at his papers with concentrated attention that she suspected had nothing to do with the papers. At the far end of the board table, the chair for the third member sat empty. Harlan's chair. She found him without looking for him. He was standing on the far side of the room with Pruitt and Aldous Beck, wearing his good coat, his face doing the pleasant container thing. He saw her come in. His expression did not change in any visible way, which she had learned meant she'd registered and been assessed, and he was deciding how to play it, which took effort. He wouldn't expend on someone he wasn't taking seriously. Good. Let him take her seriously. Martha Price was seated in the third row, back straight, gloved hands folded in her lap. She looked at Eliza when Eliza came in, and the look was not warm exactly. Martha Price was not a woman who did warm easily, but it was direct and steady, and it said, "I am here, and I am going to do what I said I would do." Eliza held the look for a moment, then gave a small nod, and Martha gave a small nod back, and that was sufficient. She and Silas found seats near the middle. He sat on her left. On her right, she was mildly surprised to find Reuben, who had apparently driven himself in at some point this morning without mentioning it. He looked straight ahead and said nothing, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. "Reuben," she said. "Miss Mercer," he said, you didn't have to come." "No, ma'am," he said, and did not elaborate, and she understood that the elaboration wasn't the point, and let it be. Harlan called the session to order at 10 o'clock. He sat at the head of the board table with the ease of a man in his natural habitat, not performing authority, simply occupying it, which was in some ways more difficult to counter than performance. He went through the procedural opening with practiced efficiency, and she watched him and thought about Owen's 6-year-old certainty that morning. You don't run, you just stay. And she felt the carved horse in her pocket and stayed. The Water Authority's formal business came first. Financial reviews, infrastructure reports, maintenance concerns for the spring. Harlan moved through it briskly, the way you move through the preliminary acts when you know what the main event is. Carol contributed occasionally, in the agreeable way of someone whose primary goal is to not be wrong. Drury asked substantive questions that slowed each section down just enough to be useful, which was, Eliza suspected, intentional. Then Harlan introduced the renegotiation clause. He presented it reasonably. That was the thing that made it difficult. He was good at this, at taking something that served exclusively his interests and framing it in language that made it sound like community stewardship. He talked about the responsibility of the Water Authority to ensure that its resources were associated with reliable, reputable enterprises. He talked about the Valley's long-term interests. He used the word accountability 4 times, which was the word he'd chosen because it was the one most likely to make anyone who opposed him sound like they were against accountability. She had to hand it to him. He was skilled. Drury waited until Harlan had finished and then said, "I'd like to open the floor before we discuss the clause itself. There are members of the community who've indicated they wish to speak." Harlan looked at Drury with the specific look of someone who expected this and has already decided how to manage it. "This is a governance session, Walt, not a public debate. Board sessions in this territory are open to public comment prior to formal vote," Drury said. "That's been the practice since the authority was established." He said it without heat, without challenge, just fact, laid out like something that was simply and boringly true. Carol looked uncomfortable. Carol, Eliza thought, was going to be the most important person in this room for the next 30 minutes, and he looked like he was already aware of this and did not enjoy it. Harlan nodded once, graciously, the nod of a man who is permitting something he knows won't matter. "Briefly," he said. Martha Price stood. Eliza had wondered how Martha would do it. She'd imagined various versions, apologetic, careful, hedged. What she got was none of those. Martha Price stood with her gloved hands at her sides, and she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had spent 30 years being listened to in this community, "I have something to correct. The room did the thing that rooms do when the person speaking has established credibility over decades. It paid attention. 3 months ago, I repeated things about Eliza Mercer that I had heard from Harlan Greed," Martha said. "I repeated them to several women in this town, and I repeated them as though they were established fact. I did not question them because the source seemed credible to me, and because I did not ask Miss Mercer herself." She paused. "I have since spoken with Miss Mercer. I have heard her account of what actually occurred, and I am here to tell this room, publicly, that what I repeated was false. What Harlan Greed told me was a fabrication built to punish a woman who refused his personal advances. I know this because she told me what he asked her for, and when she asked for it, and I know it because Harlan Greedy's account did not add up to anything coherent, when I thought about it honestly, and I had not thought about it honestly, until I was obliged to." She sat down. The room was not silent. Rooms with 40 people in them are never entirely silent, but the quality of the sound changed. The murmur that had been ambient and undifferentiated became specific, directional. She could see it moving, the thing Martha had said, finding its listeners and doing what true things do when they're finally allowed in a room. They rearranged the furniture. Harlan's face had not changed. He was very good. Two other women spoke after Martha, not dramatically, not with elaborate testimony, but with the specific weight of women saying in public what they had already decided was true in private. One of them was the wife of the man who ran the feed store. The other was a woman Eliza barely knew, which made it more significant rather than less. Then Drury said, "Miss Mercer, you've indicated you wish to speak." She stood. 40 people looked at her. She had not been looked at by 40 people at once in this town, since Harlan's voice in the mercantile, and the comparison was not lost on her. But it was different. The looking was different. It was not the looking of people who had already decided. It was the looking of people who were waiting to see what she did with the space she'd been given. She thought about what she'd prepared. She had sat at the kitchen table 2 evenings ago and written notes, not a speech, because she did not trust herself to deliver a speech, and because Harlan would hear a speech and find its edges, but the core things she needed to say, in the order they needed to be said. She did not look at the notes. "I'm not going to stand here and ask anyone to feel sorry for me," she said. "I know how that sounds, and I don't want it." She looked at the room, not at Harlan specifically, but broadly, the way you look at people you're talking to rather than performing for. "I came to this town 8 years ago. I built a business here. I served customers here, some of whom are in this room, and I did good work. You know whether that's true. You don't need me to tell you." A few people in the rows nodded. Small movements, but real. In October, Harlan Greed asked me to accompany him to his property under a pretense I won't detail here because the detail is embarrassing and the detail is not the point. The point is that I said no, and the point is that within a week of my saying no, he had spoken to enough people in enough places that I no longer had a business, a workspace, a reputation, or anywhere to sleep that wasn't someone else's back room. She kept her voice level. Not because anything he said was true. Because he said it, and he said it with the confidence of a man who has never experienced a consequence for anything he said. Harlan shifted in his seat. One small shift, she noticed it. "I'm not asking this board to consider my reputation when it votes today," she said. "I'm asking this board to consider why a renegotiation clause that didn't exist last month suddenly exists now, and what changed between then and now." She looked at Carol directly, because Carol was the vote that mattered. "What changed is that I moved to the Boone Ranch. What changed is that Harlan Greed, having failed to remove me from this valley through social means, is now attempting to remove me through legal ones." She paused. "I find that instructive about the clause's purpose, and I believe you should too." She sat down. The room breathed. Silas, on her left, did not touch her, did not say anything. He was just there, solid and present, which was exactly what she needed and exactly what he understood she needed, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone knows you. Harlan spoke next. He was very smooth about it. He acknowledged Martha's statement with a kind of magnanimous regret, said that he was sorry if his words had been taken out of context, and that this was precisely why these matters were better handled privately rather than publicly. He said that the renegotiation clause had been under development for several months, which was a lie she couldn't immediately disprove. He said that the board's interest was the valley's water security and nothing more. He said all of this with the practiced ease of a man who has spoken his way out of rooms for 40 years and sees no reason today should be different. Carol was watching him. Then Drury said, "I'd like to enter something into the session record." He produced a document. He said it was a letter from the Territorial Land Office, responding to a formal inquiry he had submitted 2 weeks prior. He said the letter confirmed that the Valley Water Authority's founding charter did not include any provision for character review of leaseholders, that the authority's mandate was specifically and exclusively the management of water resources, and that any attempt to extend that mandate to matters of personal reputation would require a territorial review and formal amendment. Harlan's smooth expression developed for the first time a crack. That review process, Drury said, would take a minimum of 14 months and would require the authority's full records and practices to be examined by territorial auditors. He looked at Carol. Full records. All decisions, all arrangements, all modifications to any lease or agreement in the past 7 years. Carol's face had gone the specific gray of someone who has just understood what a room he's walked into. 7 years of records. 7 years of arrangements that Carol had supported when Harlan asked him to support them. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened in that room all morning. Harlan said, "Walt, this is an overreach." "It's the charter," Drury said. "It's what we signed when we took this board." The vote on the renegotiation clause was 3-0 against. Carol voted against it before Drury had finished calling the vote, with the speed of a man who has made a calculation and committed to it completely. Harlan did not vote in favor of his own clause. He sat back in his chair and he looked at the surface of the table, and he did not look at Eliza, which was the most significant thing he did that morning. The session ended 20 minutes later, the room filled with the sound of people standing, chairs moving, conversations beginning. Eliza stayed in her seat for a moment because her legs had decided to have the reaction she hadn't allowed her face, and she needed a second. Silas put his hand over hers on her knee. 1 second, then he took it away. It was enough. She stood. She was standing when Martha Price came to her. Martha was not a woman who made gestures easily, and she did not make one now. She stood in front of Eliza and she said, "I should have asked you first, before I said any of it. I should have asked you." "Yes," Eliza said. "You should have." Martha held her gaze. She had clearly expected something more mitigating than that, and she absorbed the plainness of it with visible discomfort, and then she nodded. "I know," she said. "Thank you for coming today," Eliza said. "It was the right thing, and it cost you something, and I know it did." Martha's expression did something complicated. "It cost me considerably less than what it cost you," she said. "Yes," Eliza said again, "but you did it anyway. That matters." Martha left. Drury came to shake Silas's hand and then Eliza's with the solid grip of a man whose respect was not casually distributed. Reuben, beside her, said nothing and pulled on his hat, which was his version of everything he might have said. Harlan left the room without looking at her. Pruitt followed. Aldous Beck paused at the door, and he looked at Eliza with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Something between assessment and the reluctant acknowledgement of a man who knows which side of a thing he's been on. And then he left too. She stood in the emptying room and looked at the board table and the windows and the carved lintel she'd never been inside to see from this angle. And she thought about the 8 years she'd spent in this town, and the 3 months that had tried to undo them, and the 6 weeks that had rebuilt something better than what had been there before, and she felt not triumphant, not vindicated in any clean way. She felt tired and real and completely, solidly present in the specific square feet she was standing in, which was the most grounded she had been in longer than she could accurately remember. "Ready?" Silas said. "Yes," she said. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and she watched the valley open up around them, the same way she'd watched it close in when they arrived. And she thought about the difference between going somewhere and going home, and how the difference was not about distance or direction, but about what was waiting. What was waiting was Owen on the porch with the specific posture of a child who has been trying not to watch the road and has failed. He saw the wagon, and he came down the steps at a controlled pace that barely contained what was underneath it. "How did it go?" he said, before they'd finished tying the horses. "We won," Silas said. Owen processed this. "Won how?" "The clause didn't pass," Eliza said. "The water arrangement stays as it is." He nodded slowly, working through the implications. Then, "And Harlan?" "Harlan has a great deal to think about," she said. "I imagine he'll be thinking for a while." Owen considered this. "Good," he said, and went back up the porch steps with his hands in his pockets. And Eliza understood that was the complete and sufficient expression of his feelings on the matter. Hazel appeared in the doorway above him. She had clearly been standing just inside the door the entire time, listening. She looked at Eliza with the assessment she always brought to things that mattered, the internal ledger running its check. "You look different," Hazel said. "Do I?" "Yes." Hazel looked at her seriously. "You look like you stopped waiting for something." Eliza looked at this girl, 9 years old and already more perceptive about people than most of the 40 who had been in that room this morning. She thought about what it was, exactly, that she'd stopped waiting for. The permission, the reprieve, the moment when the world decided she was allowed to take up space in it again. "I think I finally figured out," Eliza said, "that I didn't need to wait." Hazel absorbed this. Then, Nora made pie, she said, in the tone of someone offering a reward that has been fairly earned. Rhubarb. That sounds perfect, Eliza said. The pie was not perfect. The crust had cracked on one side and the filling had gone slightly over in one corner and left a dark drip on the bottom of the oven that Nora was philosophical about. They ate it anyway, all of them at the table, Silas and the children and Nora and Reuben, who had apparently decided that the occasion warranted staying for a meal and had not been wrong. And the pie was good in the imperfect way that things often are, which meant it was honest, and honest was what this table did best. She didn't think of it as an ending that evening. Endings were for things that were over, and this wasn't over. It was, she thought more accurately, a clearing. The storm had passed and the road was visible and the ground underneath was solid, and now the actual work could continue without the weather fighting it at every turn. The actual work was considerable. The ranch still had a lease balance that needed managing. The children still needed the things children need, which change shape daily and without warning. Nora still needed to figure out what her life was going to be in this valley, and that was its own unfinished story. Reuben still found reasons to come to the kitchen door at intervals that suggested he was paying attention to whether the coffee was on. And Eliza herself still had things she was working out, who she was outside of surviving, what she wanted past the next season, what it meant to build something when you'd spent so long expecting it to be taken. But those were good problems. She had learned, somewhere in the 6 weeks behind her, to tell the difference between a problem that was taking something from you and a problem that was asking you to grow. And these were the second kind, and the second kind she could work with. The night after the board session, after the children were in bed and Nora had gone upstairs and the house had gone to its nighttime quiet, she and Silas sat on the front porch for a while. It was cold, legitimately, seriously cold, and they had their coats and she had a blanket over her knees and the sky above the Wyoming plains was doing what it did in deep winter, which was display every star ever made in a darkness so clear it was almost aggressive. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. "You say that," she said, "when you've been thinking about something long enough that you've worn it smooth." He looked at her. "That's—" He started to object and then stopped. "That's accurate," he said. "What have you worn smooth?" He looked at the sky. He took his time with it, because he was who he was, and he took his time with things, and she had learned to find that quality comfortable rather than trying to fill it. "I've been thinking about the morning I came to Adele's door," he said, "about what I was actually doing. Because I told you it was about work, and it was, and I told you it wasn't only about that, and it wasn't. But I've been thinking about what the third thing was, the one I didn't name." "What was it?" she asked. "I was tired of standing on the outside of something looking at it," he said. "I had been surviving the same way you'd been surviving, moving fast enough that I couldn't feel the stillness, working hard enough that I didn't have to sit with what was missing." He paused. "And then I watched you for 3 months, in this town that was trying to make you nothing, and you were still whole, still yourself, still showing up." He shook his head slightly. "And I thought, whatever that is, whatever she's made of, I want to be in a house with it. I want my children to see it every day. I want to be close enough to it that it reminds me what I'm supposed to be." The cold pressed down around them and the stars held their positions, and she sat with what he'd said. "That's a lot to put on a person," she said. She said it without accusation. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to carry it. I'm telling you why I came. There's a difference." "There is," she agreed. "Eliza." He turned his head and looked at her directly, with the open expression she'd come to trust as his most honest one. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you answer, this—" He gestured at the house behind them, the life inside it. "None of that is conditional on your answer. I need you to believe that first." She looked at him. "I believe it," she said. And she did. That was the thing about this man. He had never made the offer contingent on the conditions. He had given without extraction from the first morning, and 6 weeks of watching him had not uncovered a version of him that operated differently. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not an elaborate question, just the question. She sat with it. She had known it was coming, not because she was prescient, but because she had been paying attention, and she was very good at paying attention, and the shape of things had been pointing in this direction for long enough that the direction was not a surprise. What surprised her was what she felt when it arrived. Not fear, not the skepticism she would have expected from herself, The woman who had packed her bag in the dark and expected nothing. What she felt was simple. She felt like someone who has been walking a long distance and has arrived at a specific place and knows, in the body rather than the mind, that this is where the walking was taking her. She also felt like herself, completely, undisputably herself. Not grateful enough to comply. Not out of options. Not afraid of what refusing would cost her. Herself. In a coat on a cold porch with stars overhead and $43 in a tin she no longer needed for escape, and a man beside her who had looked at her most reduced and knocked on the door anyway. Yes, she said. He did not whoop or grab her. This was consistent with who he was, and she was glad of it. He took her hand, her right hand, covered by the blanket, and held it, and they sat with the yes between them the way you sit with something real, not rushing past it to the next thing, just letting it be what it was. Hazel's going to say she already knew, Eliza said after a while. She did already know, Silas said. She's 9. She's an unusually perceptive 9, he said. Owen told you in 4 seconds about my bag. Owen doesn't have an agenda, Silas said. He just notices things and reports them. Hazel has an agenda. What's her agenda? He thought about it. I think her agenda is this, he said. What we're sitting in right now. He paused. She's been working toward it since about the 3rd day you were here. Eliza shook her head, and the laugh that came out was real and complete, the kind that warmed your chest from the inside. That child, she said. She gets it from her mother, he said. And the way he said it was not sad. It was fond, and she heard the difference clearly, and she knew that was what healing actually looked like when it was real. Not the absence of the person you'd loved, but the ability to carry them forward without bleeding. They stayed on the porch until the cold won, which took a while because neither of them was in a hurry to be anywhere else. And then they went inside, and she put more wood on the stove, and he checked the door latches the way he always did last thing, and they said goodnight in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs, and she went up to her room. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and she thought about the word yes and what it contained. Not just the answer to his question, but the larger yes underneath it. The yes to staying, the yes to belonging somewhere, the yes to being chosen and choosing back, the yes to the terrifying and worthwhile project of building something with another person when you both knew better than to expect it to be easy. She was not naive about what was ahead. She knew Silas, and she knew his difficulties, the box that got full, the stillness he fled, the grief that still lived in the still hours even if it didn't bleed anymore. She knew her own difficulties with equal clarity, the way she went quiet when she was scared instead of asking for help, the way she had to fight her own instinct to preemptively pack the bag, the way she had to remind herself regularly that staying was a choice she was making rather than a situation she had fallen into. These were not small things. They were the daily material of actually being in something rather than surviving alongside it, and they required the kind of attention that didn't end because you said yes once. But she was not afraid of the work. She had learned, in the months between the mercantile and this ceiling, that the thing she'd been most afraid of was not the work but the exposure, the risk of being seen and found insufficient. And she had been seen, completely, and she was here, and the ceiling above her was solid, and the house around her held. The spring came eventually, the way Wyoming spring comes, reluctantly, fitfully, with relapses into cold that made you feel it was never going to commit. But it came. The snow retreated north, and the ground became honest about itself, and the cattle moved back out to the pastures, and the days got longer in increments that were at first imperceptible, and then suddenly, unmistakably, real. Eliza and Silas married in April. Not in the town hall. She had spent enough significant moments in public buildings that she had no desire to spend this one there, but at the ranch, in the front yard, with the mountains showing themselves clean and bright in the spring air, and about 20 people who had earned the right to be present. Walt Drury was there. Reuben was there with Dell and Hatch, who wore their good shirts with the specific discomfort of young men who don't own many occasions for good shirts. Nora Fenn stood beside Eliza in the way of a woman who has become, in 5 months, the kind of friend that develops when 2 people survive adjacent difficulties at the same time and find each other useful and then realize useful has become something else entirely. Martha Price came. Eliza had not invited her and had not invited her, and Martha arrived with the same straight posture and folded gloves as the board session, and stood at the back and said nothing and left afterward without making anything of her presence. It was the right thing to do, and Eliza recognized it as such. Hazel stood beside her father. She had done her own hair for the occasion, which meant the braid was uneven and had a piece of green thread worked into it, from the coat repair, Eliza suspected, because Hazel was the kind of person who used what was available. And she had the expression of someone who has achieved a goal she had been working toward since October, and is allowing herself a private moment of satisfaction. Owen wore his good shirt without complaint and held the carved horse in his coat pocket throughout the entire ceremony, which Eliza did not find out until later and found, when she found out, entirely right. They said what they said to each other in front of the people who had been present for the becoming of it, and it was not a long ceremony because neither of them were people who needed things to be long, and the air was cold in the way of spring mornings, and the mountains were very clear, and Silas's hands were warm, and she knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. That was the thing she would think about later, in the years that followed, when she tried to find what was most true about that morning. Not that it was beautiful, though it was. Not that she was happy, though she was. But that she was fully present in it, making the choice with her eyes open and her feet on the ground, in full knowledge of the difficulties and the uncertainties and the things that would require years of sustained attention to navigate. She was choosing it anyway. She was choosing it because of what it was, not in spite of the fear. And that was different from anything she'd chosen before. The years at the Boone Ranch built themselves the way years do when the foundation is honest, not without trouble, not without the winters that were worse than expected, or the seasons when the money was tight in ways that made everyone careful and a little quiet, not without the arguments that happened when two stubborn people who were also trying to be kind to each other got the balance wrong on a particular day, not without grief. Silas's grief for Clara did not disappear because he loved again. It settled, the way Hazel had said grief settled, the way a scar is still there but stops demanding your attention at every moment. And Eliza had her own version of grief for the years she'd lost to fear, and the woman she might have been a decade earlier if someone had come to a back door for her before she'd learned to stop expecting it. They talked about these things. Not always easily, not always with the right words on the first attempt, but they talked. That was the thing Eliza held on to in the years after, the thing she would have told anyone who asked her what made the difference. They talked. When it was hard, they didn't pretend it wasn't, and when one of them was struggling, they found the words eventually, even when eventually took longer than either of them wanted, and the finding was what mattered even when the words were imperfect. Hazel grew. She grew with the specific intensity of a person who has a great deal of interior life and the determination to do something with it. By 15, she was teaching the younger children at the Red Creek School 2 afternoons a week, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had identified a gap and was not the kind of person who identified gaps and then waited for someone else to fill them. By 18, she was talking about the Territorial College in Laramie with the focused, practical certainty of someone who has not yet had the resources to do something but has assumed she will eventually, and that assumption had its own kind of gravity. Eliza and Silas made sure she went. It required planning and sacrifice in the way. Most things that mattered required planning and sacrifice, and they did it without making her feel the weight of it because they had both grown up under different kinds of weight and knew what that cost. Owen grew differently. Slower in some directions, more certain in others. He never became a talker. That was simply not who he was, and he found his peace with that earlier than most people find their peace with who they're not. What he became was the person on the ranch who understood the animals better than anyone, including Silas, and by the time he was 12, this was simply an established fact that everyone operated around. He had his father's patience and his mother's face, and Eliza watched him and thought sometimes about the 6-year-old who hadn't spoken 50 words in a summer, who had pointed her to the feed without explanation, who had stood in the kitchen doorway because the stove was warm and she was there. Nora Fenn stayed in the valley. She did eventually find work at one of the northern ranches, and then she found something else there. Not exactly romance, because Nora was not a woman who organized herself around men anymore, but a kind of settled companionship that suited her better, with a quiet older woman named Iris who ran the household with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of someone who had been alone long enough to have gotten serious about appreciating company. Nora and Eliza stayed close across the distance, the kind of close that doesn't require frequent contact to be real. Harlan Greed did not leave the valley. She would have been surprised if he had. Men like Harlan did not retreat, they simply adjusted the terrain. What happened was more incremental and in some ways more satisfying. His authority diminished by degrees, as authority tends to do when it can no longer rely on fear, because the things he had used as instruments, the water board, the social standing, the network of people who owed him favors, these things required maintenance, and the maintenance required people to believe the maintenance was worth their while. And people slowly, one by one, stopped believing that. Carol retired from the board 2 years after the session. His replacement was a woman named Eliza Mercer, who had run the Southern Holdings with unusual competence for a decade and had no patience for arrangements that served one interest under the language of serving everyone. Walt Drury outlasted both of them and retired at 73 with the contentment of a man who has been consistently on the right side of things and knows it. Harlan still had money, and he still had the house on the hill, and he still had people who deferred to him when they needed something he could provide. But he had lost the thing he valued most, which was the ability to make someone disappear by saying the right things to the right people. He had tried it with Eliza Mercer, and she had refused to disappear, and that refusal had been public and documented and attached to a name that the Valley now said in a different tone, and Harlan had learned at 60-something years old something he should have learned earlier. Some people, when you push them, push back, and the pushing back changes the landscape for everyone watching. She did not forgive him. She had thought about it, seriously, because she was an honest person, and honest people think seriously about forgiveness. But she had decided, somewhere in the middle of thinking about it, that forgiveness was something she gave to people who were in her life and whose presence required her to find a way past what had happened. Harlan Greed was not in her life. He was in her county, and she managed that without difficulty, and she wished him nothing in particular, which she thought was the most honest position available to her. What she did instead of forgiving him was something she thought was more useful. She stopped letting him be a story she told about herself. He had been the story for a while, the organizing event of a particular period, the villain of the chapter. But he was not the point of her life. She was the point of her life, and the people in it, and the work of the ranch, and the children growing, and the friendships that built themselves slowly and honestly, and the particular quality of early mornings on the porch when the mountains were doing something with the light, and Silas brought her coffee without asking if she wanted it because he already knew. Years later, she didn't mark exactly when, because life doesn't actually organize itself into the years later moments that stories require. It just continues being lived. Hazel came back from Laramie for a visit with a man she introduced with the specific casualness of someone who is trying very hard not to make too much of something. He was a quiet, thoughtful person who asked real questions and listened to the answers. And Hazel watched him with the expression of someone who has found a thing they've been looking for and is still a little surprised it was findable. Eliza watched her watch him, and she thought, she learned this. Not the particulars of it, not the specific person, but the general project. The belief that being chosen by someone honest and staying and building something together was a thing that could be done, that it was available, that it did not require being someone other than who you were. Hazel had watched her father choose and stay. She had watched Eliza choose and stay. She had grown up inside the daily evidence that love was not a condition that arrived and required nothing, but a practice that required everything and returned more than it cost. That was the thing Eliza thought about sometimes, when the days were quiet and the ranch was doing what it did, and the mountains were where they'd always been, and Silas was somewhere on the property doing something useful. She thought about what it was worth to stay. Not dramatically, not in the summative way of someone counting blessings, but practically, honestly, the way she thought about most things. She had packed a bag once. She had stood at a door with her hand on the knob and every reason to go through it, and she had answered 3 knocks instead, and what she had walked into was not easy and not perfect and not without its winters, its dry years, its mornings when the weight of things settled in the joints the way cold settled in old timber. But it was real. Completely, stubbornly, daily real. And real, she had decided long ago, was worth more than safe. Real asked more of you. Real required you to be the full version of yourself instead of the reduced version that traveling light demanded. Real meant that when something broke, you fixed it, and when you couldn't fix it alone, you said so, and when the other person said so, you were there. She was still there. That was the thing. After everything, the mercantile, The back room, the suitcase, the back door, the porch, the storm, the board session, the April morning with the mountains showing clear. She was still here, standing in the same square feet she'd been standing in for years, in the life she had not planned and had not been promised and had not been easy, and she would not have traded a single difficult day of it for the safety of the suitcase and the stage to Laramie. One evening in late autumn, many years into the life she'd built, Eliza was on the porch when Owen came and sat with her. He was grown now, a man by every measure, with his mother's face and his father's patience and his own particular quality of silence that was the most comfortable silence she had ever sat beside. He didn't say anything for a while, which was standard, and she didn't feel it, which he'd always appreciated. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something." "What?" she said. "That morning, when Papa came back from town and you'd already packed your bag. I was 6. I don't remember all of it, but I remember thinking when he drove out before sunrise." He paused. "I remember thinking, please let her be there. Please let her not have gone yet." He looked at the mountains. "I didn't know you. I'd never seen you. I just knew he was going to try, and I remember thinking, please." She looked at her son, not by blood, but by everything else. By 6 years old and carved horses and 50 words and a summer and a hen that recovered against the odds and 10,000 mornings at a kitchen table. "I was there," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm glad." She put her hand over his for a moment. He let her, which he always had. The mountains held their positions. The evening came down over the valley in the unhurried way of November, steady and certain, taking its time. The ranch below them was doing what it did, which was continue, not perfectly, not always smoothly, but continuously, which was the only way anything real continued. She had been afraid once, standing at a door, that courage meant knowing the outcome in advance, that you were only brave if you could see where you were going. She knew now that courage was simpler and harder than that. Courage was opening the door. Courage was setting down the bag. Courage was answering 3 knocks from a man you didn't know yet, and walking into the life on the other side of them, and staying there even when staying was difficult, and doing it again the next day and the day after that, for all the days that were given, with your feet on the ground and your eyes open and the full weight of yourself present in the life you had chosen. She had chosen this life. It had chosen her back, and that she had come to understand.